Chapter 745. Come and fight. Only these two words echoed in the field outside the Verdant Canyon. It spread to the Green Mountains, the paddy fields, and everyone in the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army. There was silence in the Coalition Army. Bai Haixin raised his eyebrows and looked at the people at the entrance of the canyon. His eyes grew colder and colder. He said, "Since you want to fight, then let's fight. Get the papal cavalrymen ready to charge." The academy was famous, but this veteran of the Yen kingdom did not feel any pressure. That was because countless wars in human history had proven that even the strongest cultivator would die when facing the charge of the heavy cavalry and the sky full of arrows. Even a grand cultivator who had entered the knowing destiny state would have no power in front of the army. Unless he entered the limitless state, he would be able to ignore the arrows. Everyone knew that the second brother of the academy was very powerful, but no one knew exactly how powerful he was. In the battle at the Lank Temple in the autumn of last year, Yi Su, the world wayfarer of Haoyan Taoism, and Qin Yin, the world wayfarer of Buddhism, attacked him one after another. But everyone knew that he was far from the 5 states, so he was not invincible. It was absurd and ridiculous to think that he could stop the march of the vast army. The horses neighed and hoofbeats sounded. 400 heavy cavalrymen of the West Hill Divine Palace charged toward the Verdant Canyon. These powerful cavalrymen and their mounts were all wearing strong and heavy armors. Every time the horses' hooves touched the ground, a deep pit would be formed. Countless pieces of soil were trampled and then lifted up, causing smoke and dust. The entire field began to shake. The friction and collision of the armors of the Divine Hall's heavy cavalry became a terrifying tsunami. The armored heavy cavalry was the most powerful way to deal with cultivators on the battlefield. The armors of these papal cavalrymen were all engraved with talisman lines by talisman masters. It was difficult for the cultivators' flying swords or other natal items to break the armor, so it was even more difficult to hurt the cavalrymen. Once the heavy cavalry with terrifying power and speed came into contact with the relatively weak bodies of the cultivators, they could smash the cultivators to death in an instant. In the past battles, the armies of various countries had used this method to deal with cultivators and had never failed. At this time, even though it was the disciples of the academy standing at the entrance of the Verdant Canyon, the Divine Hall Coalition Army was still full of confidence. Because no matter how they looked at it, there was no way for the Academy's disciples to resolve such a simple and direct charge. No matter how strong Junimo was, he was still just a human. In the sacred sedan, Yi Hongyu looked at the Verdant Canyon in the distance. She was extremely calm, but deep in her eyes, there was a hint of thought and confusion. She thought differently from the others in the Coalition Army. She knew that the disciples of the Academy would not lose so easily. She did not hold out any hope for the charge of the hundreds of riders. However, she could not understand what else Junimo could do other than forcefully block the hundreds of cavalrymen with his astonishing sword Dao. Once he really started doing that, she was certain that he would definitely lose today. Even if Junmo's strength was beyond imagination, he would definitely be exhausted if he only used an iron sword to cut the hundreds of cavalrymen in the field. Even if he still had strength left, there were more than 200,000 West Hill Divine Palace soldiers in the field. To block the mighty army outside the Verdant Canyon with his own strength was not something that a human could achieve. Even Mr. Ku did not have such an ability back then, let alone Yi Futian. The heavy cavalry of the West Hill Divine Palace stepped across the field and approached the Verdant Canyon. At this time, the cavalrymen began to really speed up. Their hooves were like a shower and the sound was like thunder. Smoke and dust were gradually rising into the air. An extremely tense and murderous aura rose in the field with the sound of hooves. Unexpectedly, the disciples of the Academy standing at the entrance of the Verdant Canyon did not even look at the hundreds of horrible heavy cavalry of the Divine Hall. It was as if they did not see them at all. The 6th brother was digging the ground to build a furnace, and the 4th brother was nailing iron nails on the ground. No one knew if he was going to settle the tents or do something else. Beigong Weiyang and Shimin Buhua sat opposite each other, their fingers pressed on the strings of the zither and flute, as if they were tuning. Only the 7th sister's attention was on the front. She wanted to sew to calm down so she could not focus on the embroidery frame. Instead, her eyes fell on the back of the 2nd brother in front of her. The sunlight fell on the 2nd brother and was reflected by the surface of his armor. It was elegant and magnificent. 400 cavalrymen did not sound like a lot. In fact, if they appeared in front of the real world, it would be a black mass, which would bring a great sense of oppression and impact to the eyes. Especially the heavy cavalry. When the cavalry charged, the width of the area where the two armies met was not decided by the charging party. At this time, the disciples of the Academy were at the entrance of the Verdant Canyon. So even if thousands of cavalrymen charged at the same time, the charging area could only accommodate a dozen heavy cavalry at most. The heavy cavalry of the Divine Hall was very good at tactics. As they officially began to charge, the formation of the 400 cavalrymen changed naturally without any command. Gradually they became a sharp charging formation. When they were about 2,000 feet away from the exit of the Verdant Canyon, the formation of the heavy cavalry of the Divine Hall changed unexpectedly again. The 200 cavalrymen in front separated from the two behind, and then the 200 cavalrymen in front completed a perfect change of direction at high speed. They took a detour to the east for some distance, then turned back and continued to charge toward the Verdant Canyon. The 200 cavalrymen in the back kept charging straight and came to the front. This charging tactic was the most effective way to maintain the pressure of the heavy cavalry. It could also avoid the impact and interference of the relatively narrow battlefield. The charging formation of the 400 heavy cavalrymen of the Divine Hall suddenly changed, but their momentum did not weaken at all. Instead it became stronger. The horses' hooves flew and the sound was like thunder. Smoke and dust rose. At this time, the disciples of the academy at the entrance of the Verdant Canyon had already seen the magnificent details of the cavalry's armor. Seeing hundreds of cavalrymen charging toward them, the second brother's expression did not change, and his hand holding the iron sword was still steady. The seventh sister pinched the embroidery needle. Her face was a little pale and she began to feel nervous. Clang? Beigong Weiyang slightly raised his eyebrows. His wrist was as light as a cloud sleeve, and his fingers left the strings. He did not look at the battlefield. He did not look at the dense cavalry that would soon flood the entrance of the Verdant Canyon. He also did not look at the second handsome brother. He focused and focused on the zither. When his fingers left the strings, the zither began to vibrate, and then there was a clang. He raised his left hand that had been quietly resting on his knee and fell down carefully and calmly. The edge of his index finger and thumb touched the still vibrating strings, and then he began to casually twirl them. Since he began to learn the zither, he had repeated this action all the time. No one knew how many times he had done it, so it was very casual and elegant, like a master. The seemingly simple action actually contained infinite details. Except for Shimen Buhua, who was wiping the flute, no one could clearly see the meaning of his twirl. The trembling of the strings suddenly intensified, but the amplitude of the vibrations was forcefully controlled by the fingers on the strings to a very small range. As a result, the sound coming from the strings became more and more sonorous and sharper. Clang. The pebbles on the ground kept trembling, making a rustling sound. The sound of the zither spread more than 100 feet away and then disappeared. The pebbles on the ground were calm and silent. Thus, a circle with a radius of more than 100 feet was formed, with the zither as the center. Shimen Buhua's hearing was the most sensitive. His face instantly turned pale and he painfully covered his ears. Wang Qi frowned with some discomfort. Seventh sister's fingers that held the embroidery needle trembled. Second brother's back was still motionless. The sound of the zither was loud and sharp in this area, which made people feel pain. When the sound of the zither left this area, it became silent, which made people feel confused. Silence did not mean that there was no sound. Not hearing it did not mean that there was no sound. There were many sounds in nature that human beings could not hear, but other creatures could. Such as horses. The heavy cavalry charging at the front suddenly disappeared from people's sight. A dull crash sounded and smoke and dust rose. For some reason, the heavy cavalry's mount suddenly lost its strength in its front limbs. In a high-speed charge, this situation was equivalent to suicide. Then another heavy cavalry disappeared. As the horse under him fell heavily to the ground, more heavy cavalrymen of the Divine Hall fell to the ground one after another. With these scenes, the aggressive charge turned into an extremely tragic crash. Dozens of horses at the front neighed miserably and fell to the ground, with broken limbs and broken bones and blood splashing everywhere. In just a moment, the field more than 100 feet away from the Verdant Canyon was piled up into a small mountain of flesh and armor by the charging heavy cavalry. One could imagine how terrible the situation was. In the divine chariot in the south, the great divine priest of revelation opened his eyes and looked at the Verdant Canyon. In his wise and experienced eyes, there was vigilance and emotion. The loudest sound is silent. Why do the strings move? The great divine priest of revelation's lips moved slightly. This sentence was only mouthed but no sound came out. The loudest sound is silent. Beigong Weiyang's zither was loud, so the horses were afraid. The teaching sound of the great divine priest of revelation was also loud, so it spread to the Verdant Canyon. When the soundless zither met the soundless teaching sound, it became really silent. The heavy cavalry who were still charging suddenly felt relieved. They fiercely squeezed their horses' bellies and urged their mounts to bypass their companions who had suffered heavy casualties in front of them, and made a final charge toward the canyon. Beigong Weiyang's fingers that were playing the zither were shaken off, and there was a very thin line of blood on the edge of his fingernails. He looked at his junior brother Shimin Buhua. Shimin Buhua raised his flute and blew gently. The wind passed through the flute, but it was also silent. Beigong Weiyang smiled happily, and his fingers fell on the strings again. Outside the verdant canyon, the sound of hooves, the sound of horses neighing, the sound of killing, the sound of falling to the ground, the sound of screams. The senior brother and junior brother looked intoxicated. They played the flute and the zither, but there was no sound. At this time there was silence, but there was sound. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 746. Although the verdant canyon had collapsed, the entrance was still relatively flat and spacious. However, it was blocked by countless huge rocks not far in, like a terrifying iron wall. Hundreds of heavy cavalrymen rushed from the south. Their purpose was to push the academy disciples to death with the help of the terrible impact. In such a terrain, even if they succeeded, there was no chance of survival. Therefore, these heavy cavalrymen were ready to die. Although they saw their companions falling to the ground and their faces turned pale, they still gritted their teeth and continued to rush forward. After a long time, the field hundreds of feet away from the exit of the verdant canyon was covered with black bodies. The war horses neighed miserably and the seriously injured heavy cavalrymen struggled to stand up, but they could not. The scene was extremely bloody and miserable. Only the last dozens of cavalrymen at the back were sure that the charge had failed and retreated with great difficulty. In the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army in the south, the great divine priest of Revelation stopped chanting and looked in the direction of the verdant canyon. His old face showed a very complicated expression. He sighed and said, "Rhythm is the end. Even if you too cultivate to the knowing destiny state, you can't see the end of the way of heaven. Why do you have to do this?" The great divine priest of Revelation's voice sounded at the exit of the verdant canyon. Beigong Weiyang understood the meaning of this sentence. He looked to the south and said, "All the methods in the world are Tao. Cultivating rhythm is cultivating the way of heaven. However, rhythm is not used for fighting but for understanding. What's the difference between a knowing destiny state cultivator and an ordinary person? I thought the great divine priest was an elegant person, but you don't even understand this." When he was talking to the great divine priest of Revelation, no one paid attention to him at the entrance of the verdant canyon. They were all quietly doing their own things. Seventh sister was dividing the lines, and fourth brother was holding a sand table and instructing sixth brother to insert something. Of course, the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army would not give them any chance to rest. When the heavy cavalry's charge was about to be thwarted, countless cavalry and archers had already rushed out of the formation. They galloped to the verdant canyon for a distance and then pulled their bows and arrows. Hearing a military order, countless hardwood bowstrings buzzed and countless arrows left the bowstrings. With a shrill sound, they went straight to the blue sky as if they were going to shoot through the sky. Countless arrows reached the highest point in the air and then began to fall. The shrill sound of breaking through the air became sharper and more terrifying. Finally, it turned into a dark storm of arrows falling toward the mouth of the verdant canyon. Second brother stood in front of the formation and looked at the dense arrows falling like rain. He had no intention of dodging at all. He just reached out and put down his mask. With a crisp sound of metal clashing, the armor covered his whole body. Dang 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 dang. A series of crisp and muffled sounds of arrows colliding rang out continuously, almost simultaneously. There were at least 20 arrows that accurately hit his body. The sharp arrowhead, with great speed and power, spun and fiercely collided with the armor on his body. However, at this moment, about 3 hairs below the surface of the armor, there was a faint glow. Dense and complicated talisman lines were activated, summoning the chi of heaven and earth in the verdant canyon and turning it into an armor similar to the chi of heaven and earth on the surface of the metal armor. An ear-piercing sound of friction rang out. The arrowheads of those arrows were extremely sharp, but they could not even pierce through the outermost protective layer of the chi of heaven and earth. The huge impact was finally transmitted to the arrow shafts. Some of the 20 or so arrows were broken in the middle, and some were bent out of shape. They fell weakly on the ground in front of second senior brother, like useless straws. Second senior brother did not move at all, like a mountain. The long-range arrow attack basically covered a large area. Therefore, compared with second brother, who was hit by more than 20 arrows, the academy disciples had to bear more dense and terrible arrows. When the countless arrows shot by the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition army had just left the bowstrings and turned into dense black dots in the sky, the academy disciples took action in advance. Under the command of fourth brother, sixth brother inserted a dozen metal rods into the ground within a radius of more than 100 feet. The bottom of each metal rod was tied with a red line. These red lines were randomly placed on the ground with many knots in the middle. They were tied to everyone's ankles, leaving only 2 threads. One was tied to seventh sister's embroidery needle. The other was tied to second brother's waist. As the arrow rain approached, sixth brother looked up at the sky. His face, which had been blackened by the fire all year round, remained calm. His right hand, which was particularly thick because of waving the iron hammer, shook forward and a scroll was opened in his hand. It spread from east to west like a wave and instantly spread out on the dozen metal rods. Judging from the color of the scroll, it seemed to be metal, but it was very thin and tough. It could be rolled up like a quilt. The spring under the edge of the metal piece automatically connected with the metal rods and then fastened. With a cracking sound, a piece of metal cloth appeared outside the verdant canyon. It covered more than 100 feet and covered all the academy disciples except second brother, sprinkling a blue light. At this moment the arrow rain also arrived. Boom, 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 boom. Dense and muffled sounds rang above the heads of the academy's disciples, as if hundreds of the best drummers were beating the taut drum in the most presumptuous manner. None of the arrows could penetrate the metal cloth. Even if that piece of metal looked so thin and soft like paper, it would not be able to withstand it. Beigong Weiyang was playing the zither, Shimen Buhua was sticking the film, Wang Qi was decocting medicine, fourth brother was designing something new, and sixth brother was lighting the stove. The arrows fell like rain. It was quiet as usual. It seemed that they were still in the back of the mountain of the academy, not listening to the rain and concentrating on their own things. Only seventh sister frowned slightly and looked at the embroidery cloth without saying a word, because the red thread was on her embroidery needle. The surface of the metal cloth was also covered with a very thin but extremely condensed layer of chi of heaven and earth. It was like the best defensive armor, bouncing off all the falling arrows. It was an array. The red thread tied to the metal rods and everyone's ankles gradually floated up and then became slightly tighter. The academy disciples sat in the midst of the majestic arrow rain. Second brother stood in the rain like a silent mountain. Looking at this scene, many people in the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition army were in despair. But many people had already guessed this result. If the academy did not have a way to deal with the arrow rain and the heavy cavalry, how could they face the mighty Divine Hall army? Just when everyone's attention was attracted by the arrow rain, 6 swordsmen in simple clothes left the quiet carriage in the coalition army camp and walked toward the verdant canyon. The swordsman in the middle could only walk with someone holding his hand, but it was not because he could not walk. His eyes were covered with a strip of cloth, so it was probably because he could not see clearly. After the arrow rain, the 6 swordsmen walked past the cavalry camp and stopped not far from the verdant canyon. The blind swordsman was pointed in the direction by his companions and bowed to second brother with hands folded in front. Second brother lifted his mask and revealed an indifferent face. He looked at the blind swordsman and said, "Your eyes were destroyed by the academy. I let you go back to the sword garret because of your brother. You don't have to thank me." The blind swordsman was Lu Yiqing, the master of the sword garret of South Jin Kingdom, who Ning Ke had blinded his eyes after he broke through the back cliff. He was also the younger brother of the sage of sword, Lu Bai. After being sent back to the sword garret, this once proud and arrogant master of sword Taoism thought about the fiasco at the side door of the academy. His temperament had greatly improved after he was sent back to the sword garret. Not only did he not stop cultivating, but he successfully entered the knowing destiny state last spring. Lu Yiqing could not see, but he could hear second brother's voice to confirm his position. He said calmly, "I thank you not for the past but for giving us a chance to fight." His words were very sincere because it was the truth. The ability and range of a cultivator to control a flying sword was proportional to his cultivation state. Although the 6 second-generation disciples of the sword garret were powerful, they could not be compared with second brother. Earlier, when they were walking toward the verdant canyon, second brother could have killed them with his iron sword, and they would not have had a chance to fight back. "I'm just curious why Mr. Lu Bai let you fight." Second brother looked at the quiet carriage in the coalition army camp and said slowly. Lu Yiqing said, "My brother felt honored that the headmaster borrowed the sword of the sword garret in spring, but he also felt a little regretful. From then on, no one could use the sword of the human world. After thinking hard, he asked the 6 of us to practice a sword array in memory of our predecessors. This time I would like to ask Mr. Second to evaluate it. Hearing this, Second Brother's eyes lit up and he said, "Okay." Lu Yiqing said, "Thank you." Then Lu Yiqing and the other 5 disciples unsheathed their swords. The disciples of the sword Garrett learned from Lu Bai's great river swordsmanship and paid particular attention to the space in front of them. Therefore they were different from any other swordsmanship sects in the world. They were not famous for their flying swords but for walking with swords. In the past, Jun Mo admired Lu Bai's swordsmanship the most. Therefore he was not surprised to see these disciples unsheathing their swords. Unexpectedly, after Lu Yiqing and the other 5 disciples unsheathed their swords, they did not move forward. They pinched the sword formula with their hands. In the clear sound, 6 cold swords broke through the air in front of the verdant canyon and turned into countless shadows. In an instant they condensed into a sword and pierced out. In spring, the headmaster reached out to the south and borrowed the sword in the ancient pond of the sword Garrett from thousands of miles away. He killed the divine general of the Haotian divine kingdom and cut off the head of the giant golden dragon. After that, that sword was no longer an ordinary sword, but a real sword of the human world. Even Lu Bai could not use that sword anymore. Lu Bai thought hard for countless days and finally confirmed that since there was no headmaster, no one could use the sword of the human world alone. Therefore he chose another path. He gathered 6 of the most outstanding disciples of the sword Garrett and practiced a sword array. They gathered the strength of several people to perform one sword. Lu Bai was very clear that even if all the disciples of the sword Garrett gathered their strength, they would not be able to perform the sword of the headmaster. But he did not want much. As long as he could have the shape of the sword and the sword essence, it would be enough. 1,000th of the sword of the human world was enough to sweep the world. This was the sword outside the verdant canyon. Looking at the sword that broke through the air, the second brother praised, "Good sword." He stabbed the iron sword in his hand into the field in front of him. Facing such a powerful sword, he did not seem to be ready to use his sword. What was he going to do? Bai Haixin is from the South Jin Kingdom, not the Yen Kingdom. I wrote wrongly. My brain is not working well and my illness is a little troublesome. Yesterday I went to the hospital and my friends found out that I was really sick. They did not say sorry to me and sigh. I will recover as soon as possible. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 747. A hand stretched out in the air. It was a steady hand with a strong thumb and 4 slender fingers, suitable for holding a sword. But this hand was not holding anything at this time. It was just pointing at the huge sword that was breaking through the air. Several wisps of extremely faint aura were released from the fingers. The huge sword seemed to feel something and began to tremble. Then it swung up and down, left and right, more and more violently, like a person who was tied up and struggling. Second brother looked at the huge sword in silence. There was no extra emotion on his face, only calmness. The sword became more and more restless. The people who were watching the battle in the wilderness could even vaguely feel fear from the sword's struggle. The huge sword trembled more and more violently. Gradually, cracks appeared on the body of the sword, and then it split again. With a few swishing sounds, several sword shadows appeared in the air hundreds of feet above the ground. Then they turned into several sword rainbows and flew towards second senior brother's body one after another in a very circular trajectory. Although the swords were fast and sharp, they did not have any killing intent. When a flying sword flew in front of second senior brother, it suddenly slowed down and finally stopped in front of him. The body of the sword trembled slightly, like a very obedient child waiting to be punished after doing something wrong. Second brother reached out and grabbed the hilt of the sword. He plucked the flying sword and stuck it into the ground in front of him. The word plucked was very accurate because he was not snatching, or stealing. He just casually reached out and grabbed the flying sword from the air. His movements were very ordinary and natural, as if he was plucking a fruit from a tree branch. The second flying sword arrived at this time. Second brother reached out and plucked it, sticking it into the ground in front of him. The third flying sword. The fourth flying sword. The fifth flying sword. Second brother stood outside the verdant canyon. A wide iron sword was stabbed into the ground next to him. Beside the iron sword there were 5 swords stuck in the ground. It looked like a fence made of swords. The 5 swords used to be a huge sword from the sword Garrett of South Jin Kingdom. It was made by Lu Bai, the sage of sword. It had learned the style of the headmaster and the bearing of the predecessors, so its power was naturally extraordinary. However, after encountering second senior brother, the sword could only crack open again and obediently let itself be plucked off. Then it was made into a fence. The disciples of the sword Garrett looked at the scene in the verdant canyon in the distance. They were so shocked that they were at a loss. Later they found that their natal swords were out of control and their sense of perception was severely damaged. They spat out blood. There was dead silence in the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition army. Especially those great figures with profound cultivation, their expressions were even more unsightly. Only they knew what second senior brother's seemingly simple method of plucking the sword to form a fence actually meant. It was already unimaginable for the sword pavilion's sword to be forcefully separated. What shocked them even more was the scene of second senior brother retrieving the 5 swords. Cultivation was about control. A cultivator's control over his natal items started from his innate nature. Moreover, every cultivator would spend the most time and energy in his cultivation to strengthen the connection between himself and his natal item. Therefore, this kind of control was the strongest kind of relationship in the cultivation world. Even if there was a world of difference between their states, it was difficult for a high-level cultivator to sever the connection between a low-level cultivator and his natal item. Even if some truly powerful grand cultivators could use powerful means to do so, no one had ever heard of anyone who could so easily make someone else's natal item his own. Second senior brother had waved his hand and split the huge sword. The 5 flying swords obeyed his command and fell. It was obvious that he had not destroyed them but subdued them. How did he do it? In the sacred sedan, Yi Hongyu's expression became a little strange. Her beautiful cheeks flushed unnaturally and the stars in her eyes grew brighter. She looked excited and alert. There is actually someone in the world who can see through the slightest changes in the chi of heaven and earth. It turns out that before Ning Ke and I, there was already someone with the gift of fighting hard in this world. Facing the powerful sword of the sword Garrett of South Jin Kingdom, second senior brother did not choose to use his sword. He chose to attack. He used one hand. One hand was enough. However, the battle at the verdant canyon did not end there. The huge sword of the sword Garrett of South Jin Kingdom had combined 6 swords into one. At this moment, 5 swords were stuck in the ground in front of second senior brother, and 1 sword was missing. Lu Yiqing sat cross-legged in the wilderness and whistled. Blood seeped out of the white cloth that covered his eyes. Psyche power shot out. An ethereal sword shadow appeared in the blue sky and disappeared instantly. When it reappeared, it had already passed through second senior brother's position and reached the metal canopy in front of the verdant canyon. The sword firmament pavilion didn't think that they could defeat their second senior brother with this sword. From the beginning, their goal was to use this sword to hide the last sword shadow. After Lu Yiqing's eyes were blinded by Ning Ke, his heart of sword became extremely pure and steady. Being unable to see made him extremely sensitive to the chi of heaven and earth. Now his sword was as strange as a ghost. That strange sword shadow was aimed at Beigong Weiyang. The charge of the cavalrymen of Divine Hall had already proved that Beigong Weiyang was the key figure in this battle. Lu Yiqing's target had always been him and the zither on his knees. Sensing that success was right in front of him and that his natal sword was about to touch the taut strings, Lu Yiqing could not suppress his excitement and his whistling became sharper. His eyes were injured by Ning Ke at the side gate of the academy, but he did not hate the academy because it was a fair fight. He just wanted to defeat the academy even if only once, no matter who it was. The next moment, Lu Yiqing's whistling suddenly stopped. His face revealed a very complicated expression. Because he felt that his life-bond sword had touched many strands like strings. But they were not zither strings. Because there were too many of them. So many of them were like a net. A net waiting for him to throw himself into. Beigong Weiyang's attention was always on the zither strings. He did not care about what was happening on the battlefield because second brother was always standing there like a mountain, so he thought he was definitely safe. Therefore, when Lu Yiqing's indescribable sword shadow suddenly disappeared from the blue sky, flashed inside the metal canopy, appeared in front of him and was about to stab into his chest, he was startled. As the great divine priest of revelation had said, he and Shiman Buhua cultivated with rhythm. Even if they reached the knowing destiny state, they still could not fight. So he had no way to deal with this flying sword. At this moment, Beigong Weiyang thought he was really going to die. But then he remembered that there were many people around him, so he knew he would not die. He was indeed not dead. Seventh sister Mu Yu raised her wrist slightly, and the embroidery needle between her fingers went through the embroidery cloth. The red thread on the embroidery needle had been hanging on the ground, tied to everyone's ankles and the metal rods. As she moved, the messy red thread also moved. As the red thread moved, There were countless fine and tough auras coming out of the canopy. The strange sword shadow was bound by countless auras, and suddenly became like an insect in a spider's web or a beast in a swamp. No matter how hard it struggled, it could not move an inch. Lu Yiqing, who was sitting cross-legged in the field in the distance, knew the situation he was facing better than anyone else because of the connection of his natal sword. He tried to call back his natal sword without hesitation. The strange sword shadow, because of the sudden stillness, finally showed its body. It was a very dim and thin flying sword, ready to retreat quietly. Fourth brother was drawing something on the sand table with his head down. Feeling the flying sword's intention to leave, he raised his head and flicked his fingers. A yellowish fu paper flew up, fell on the sword and wrapped it up. Lu Yiqing's strange sword was extremely sharp. At this time, under the control of his psyche power, it was forced to retreat. With a sizzling sound, a crack appeared on the yellowish fu paper, and the talisman intent was not fully released. But the two were locked in a stalemate, and there was always a period of temporary stillness. At this time, an iron clamp reached out from the air. The iron clamp opened and closed, clamping the flying sword and placed it on the burning stove. The blue-hot flame instantly burned the fu paper wrapped around the sword. A heavy iron hammer was raised high and then smashed down. There was a crisp bang. The dim and thin but extremely tough strange sword was smashed and jumped up, as if it could not bear the pain. Sixth senior brother was forging iron. This was sixth brother forging swords. This was an action he had repeated all his life. Even the most hard-working swordsman in the world could not be more skillful and natural than him. So the strange sword had no chance to refuse. It was smashed into scrap metal. There was a puff. Lu Yiqing's face was pale, and his chest was covered with blood. His body swayed and he almost fell. At this time he finally understood why his strange sword could hide from second brother's eyes. It was because these academy disciples did not care about his strange sword at all. This strange sword of yours is not bad. You are also good to be able to enter the knowing destiny state in such a short time. But what is really good is the big sword from before. Second brother said, Lu Bai's idea is good. The teacher's sword of the world can sweep the world with just a wisp of sword style. Unfortunately, your cultivation states are a little weak. If there were 6 swordsmen in the knowing destiny state, it would be much more difficult for me to deal with them. Lu Yiqing stood up with the help of his fellow disciples. He wiped the blood off his lips and listened to the direction of the voice. He bowed sincerely and said, Thank you for your advice, Mr. Second. Go back and tell Lu Bai that since we have to fight in the end, we might as well fight now. Why should we let you guys die? Now that I am in my peak state, I can fight to my heart's content. Second brother looked to somewhere in the south and said expressionlessly. In the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army camp in the south. The quiet horse carriage was still very quiet. After a while, a somewhat lonely voice came from the carriage. The more you fight, the stronger you become. Since you want to fight to your heart's content, I naturally have to wait for you to fight. Otherwise, wouldn't it be a waste of the battle between us? Better, I will write 2 chapters tomorrow. In addition, I recommend a new book by Xiao Sarang. The book is called The Strongest Prison System, and the book number is 2533323. Please support it. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 748. Countless arrows lay on the metal tarp, forming a thick layer that looked like dark dry straws. It covered the metal tarp and made it look like a thatched hut. The cool autumn wind blew on the edge of the thin metal tarp, making a rustling sound as if it was flipping the paper in a mansion's boudoir, and no one knew when the paper would be torn. The disciples of the academy did not worry that the tarp above their heads would be torn by the autumn wind. They believed in the sixth brother's talent in material science, so they did their own things quietly. Lu Yiqing's sword had become a thin, black and edgeless iron rod on the stove. The sixth brother was still holding the iron hammer and hammering on it. No one knew what he wanted to refine the sword into. Beigong Weiyang tuned the strings and carefully wrapped a layer of soft cotton cloth around his fingers. The film that Shimin Buhua had applied had also dried and formed a protective layer on his fingertips. He pressed on the holes one by one to test the feel of the flute. The fourth brother frowned and stared at the automatically changing lines on the sand table. His calm eyes flashed with a wisp of divine sense. No one knew what he was calculating at the moment, whether it was the life and death of everyone or the end of the battle. Only the seventh sister's mood was a little strange. She was the only woman at the exit of the verdant canyon. She held the embroidery frame, held the embroidery needle, and looked down at the mandarin ducks on the embroidery cloth. In fact, she had been looking at the distant field out of the corner of her eyes. The second brother stood there like a green mountain. There was a worried look on her face. She was not worried about the current situation or the safety of her fellow disciples under the canopy, but about second brother's safety. Earlier, when Lu Yiqing's sly sword was trapped by the formation, she was the only one who noticed that a faint white turbulence had appeared on the surface of second brother's armor. That was the result of the contact between the sword intent and the talisman intent. The tarp at the exit of the Verdant Canyon was an array. It was designed by the fourth brother and her, and then arranged by her and the sixth brother. It showed the highest level of the three of them in the academy. This seemingly inconspicuous tarp array could block the autumn rain, the scorching sun, and could not be broken by the autumn wind. Most importantly, this canopy formation could protect everyone under the canopy formation, and it could transfer all the attacks that the canopy formation couldn't withstand to the disciples under the canopy, to second senior brother. When the Verdant Canyon collapsed, the Tang Empire's thousand-year assassins suddenly attacked and killed 3 divine talisman masters of the West Hill Divine Palace. Second brother once said that if the Divine Hall Coalition army wanted to cross the Verdant Canyon, they had to defeat him. It was not that he did not respect his fellow disciples of the academy, but it was the truth. Second brother would take all the attacks from the West Hill Divine Palace on behalf of his younger brothers and sisters. Therefore, before he fell, the disciples of the academy would definitely be able to defend the Verdant Canyon. However, this also meant that he had to bear more. The Sword Garret of South Jin Kingdom had attacked. Although no one had expected that the second-generation disciples of the Sword Garret would be able to defeat the people from the college, it was still shocking that they had ended up in such a pathetic state. There was dead silence in the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition army. They are only in the see-through state. We all know that the disciples of the academy are only in the see-through state. How could they set up such an amazing array? A highly accomplished array tactical master from the West Hill Divine Palace looked at the simple canopy formation at the exit of the Verdant Canyon and could not help but reveal an expression of admiration. The voice of the array tactical master came into the divine chariot. Yi Hongyu frowned slightly, and the color of the gown of judgment became darker and darker. She had lived in Chang'an for a period of time and had many dealings with the academy. However, it was not until this moment that she realized that the academy's potential was actually higher than everyone had imagined. In the decades between Kohaoren and Ningke, the 2 generations of the academy who had entered the human realm, the academy had always been very low-key. Even in the cultivation world, not many people knew who was in the back of the mountain of the academy. The West Hill Divine Palace and the Sword Garret of South Jin Kingdom naturally knew more, but their attention had always been on Mr. First, Mr. Second, and Chin Pippi and Ning Kei who had entered the academy last. That was because the back of the mountain of the academy had confirmed that only these 4 people had entered the knowing destiny state. The others had been in the see-through state for many years. Today's encounter at the entrance of the Verdant Canyon had confirmed this speculation. The disciples of the back of the mountain of the academy were indeed in the see-through state. If they were placed in the cultivation world, they would be considered masters. However, in the context of the current battle in the human world, where powerhouses in the knowing destiny state emerged one after another, these disciples in the see-through state seemed very insignificant. Even if these disciples of the back of the mountain of the academy were the most talented in certain fields in the past, who would remember their names after so many years? Furthermore, how could geniuses help cultivation? Therefore no one cared about them. The eyes of the West Hill Divine Palace had been fixed on second brother, who had walked into the wilderness like the bright moon rising from the mountains. It was not until the heavy cavalry began to charge and Lu Yiqing's swords were smashed into scrap iron that they realized they were wrong. They were all second-generation disciples, but the academy was not the Sword Garret. The academy was not any place. There was no place that could be compared to the academy. The see-through state of the academy was not an ordinary see-through state. The disciples of the back of the mountain of the academy could fend off thousands of troops with just a zither and a flute. What shocked the bigwigs in the coalition even more was that each disciple of the back of the mountain of the academy had his or her own field of expertise. These people combined could produce incredible results. This was education without discrimination. Therefore, the academy would accept people from the Devil's Doctrine and geniuses from Haotian Taoism. That was why there were people like Kohaoren and Ning Kei in the academy. This was teaching in accordance with their aptitude. Therefore, no matter if they played chess or chewed flowers, they would find their own world after learning in the academy. Could it be that the headmaster of the academy had already thought of the current situation when he accepted disciples many years ago? Yi Hongyu thought silently. Her admiration for the headmaster of the academy grew stronger. "We can't be blocked outside the verdant canyon." The great divine priest of revelation looked up at the cloudless blue sky through the top curtain of the sacred sedan. He said, "The battle between Haoyin and the headmaster of the academy is unknown. Therefore, the outcome of the battle in the human world is particularly important, and Chang'an is the key to this battle in the human world." Cheng Lishua knelt beside him and served him a cup of tea. The great divine priest of revelation took a sip of tea to moisten his dry throat. He said, "Now that the God-stunning array has been temporarily destroyed by the hierarch, the key to Chang'an is the battle between the Abbey Dean and Mr. First. As long as Mr. First can't hold the Abbey Dean back, the Abbey Dean can open the gate of Chang'an." Cheng Lishua's fingers trembled slightly. It was not until now that he knew the overall plan of Haoyin Taoism and that Chang'an was in such a dangerous situation. Chang'an will open in 6 days. But even the Abbey Dean can't completely destroy the God-stunning array. No one knows when the city will repair itself. Therefore the army must hurry over. The great divine priest of revelation looked at the green mountain in the north and the narrow exit of the verdant canyon. He said expressionlessly, "Continue. As long as you are human, you will get tired eventually." The commander's flag was raised in the camp of the coalition. Countless military orders were passed down from commander-in-chief by Haishin to the various military camps. After a while, dense and even violent hoofbeats sounded again. More than 2,000 heavy cavalrymen marched out of the formation and then divided into dozens of groups. They kept a distance from each other and rushed toward the verdant canyon like countless dark clouds. At the exit of the verdant canyon, there were still 300 seriously injured warhorses lying on the ground. Some cavalrymen were supporting each other as they walked back. All of this proved that charging was useless against the verdant canyon. But the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army had no other choice. If they abandoned their horses and fought on foot or used heavy infantry to crush them, they would only become corpses for Second Brother's iron sword. The only way they could compete with the broad and straight iron sword was the impact. This was the only way to break through the Academy's defense. It was also the best way. As the great divine priest of revelation said, as long as there were people, they would get tired. There were more than 200,000 people in the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army. They would not get tired if they took turns to charge. The concentrated sound of hoofbeats rang out and it did not stop. More than 2,000 cavalrymen maintained the most efficient formation and charged toward the verdant canyon in batches. They did not put in much strength each time, but they made sure that the disciples of the academy had to deal with it with all their strength. Most importantly, under the strict military orders, these cavalrymen had to ensure that their attacks were continuous without a moment's pause in between, so that the disciples of the academy would not have any chance to rest. The black waves formed by the cavalry kept hitting the exit of the verdant canyon. There seemed to be an invisible barrier there, an invisible reef. A dark cloud floated over and hit the verdant canyon. It broke into pieces and scattered. A black wave crashed into the verdant canyon, breaking into water foam and falling down silently. The screams of the warhorses and the sound of bones breaking rang clearly in everyone's ears. It was even louder than the dense hoofbeats. But no matter how miserable the situation in front of them was, the cavalrymen still charged expressionlessly. Their mission today was to die. Their goal was to make the disciples of the academy feel tired with their own deaths. Beigong Weiyang did not feel tired. Or rather, he did not know what it felt like to be tired. All his attention was on the zither in front of him. He lowered his head and focused on the slightest vibration of the zither strings. His loose black hair swayed in front of his eyes. His clothes had long been soaked in sweat, and even his hair had become extremely wet. As he played, beads of sweat fell from his hair. With a soft sound, the bead of sweat fell on the zither strings and was instantly burned into smoke. But he did not notice it at all. He was still playing the zither. His fingers kept plucking, twisting, and pressing on the zither strings, moving as fast as lightning. The cotton cloth wrapped around his fingers had long been torn and blood could be seen faintly. Shimanbuhua did not feel tired. He only felt a little pain. His hand was very painful. The glue that had been stuck to his fingertips had long been torn apart with the countless punching movements. It peeled off and dried into powder, flying around the flute like fog or smoke. There were already mottled blood stains on the smooth and lustrous flute. It was very beautiful when blended with the faint vermilion color of the flute. This pair of senior brother and junior brother, who were good at music, were originally the most carefree, cheerful and joking people in the back mountain of the academy. But once they immersed themselves in the world of music, they had a different kind of elegance. But at this moment they did not have any elegance to speak of. They were not in the mood to tell jokes. Their faces were pale, their lips were dry, and their hair was messy. They were as haggard as those old musicians who performed on the streets. Their expressions were very solemn, very heavy, and very solemn. This kind of heaviness made them show another kind of admirable aura. There is one more chapter. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 749. It was the first day of the Battle of Verdant Canyon. The weather was clear. It was time for a funeral, but not for anything else. Compared to the screams and cries that rang out from time to time in the wilderness, the exit of Verdant Canyon was very quiet. The zither strings trembled and the flute sounded, but no sound was heard. At this moment, a whimper suddenly sounded under the silent canopy. It was the sound of the flute. Fourth brother suddenly looked up at Shimin Buhua. He looked at his pale face and the beads of sweat on his forehead. His right hand that was holding the wooden brush trembled and his expression grew solemn. There was a clang. The sound of the zither sounded again. Seventh sister looked up. Her fingers that were holding the embroidery needle began to tremble. She looked at Beigong Weiyang and the blood-stained zither strings in front of him with a worried look on her face. Gradually the sounds of the zither and the flute sounded again. This meant that Beigong and Shimin were truly tired. They could no longer perform like before, full of energy to play the music from beginning to end. Their control could no longer be precise, and the more this was the case, the more psyche power and spirit they had to expend to deal with the charging warhorses. The people under the canopy all looked up at Beigong and Shimin, who were playing the zither and the flute. Their faces were full of worry. Second brother, who was standing in the wilderness outside the canopy, did not look back. His right hand reached for the hilt of his iron sword. Beigong and Shimin did not know that their fellow disciples were looking at them. Their spirit and attention, and even their souls, were focused on the zither and the flute. They were the first to realize the problem. They did not want to withdraw from this battle. The disciples of the academy under the canopy all knew that the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army did not care about the heavy casualties and continued to launch suicidal attacks in order to wear them down. More precisely, they wanted to wear down second brother. Because the defense of the Verdant Canyon depended on second brother. Therefore, what the younger brothers and sisters had to do was to try their best to help senior brother hold on for a while longer, so that he could rest for a while and deal with the real attack that was coming soon. Beigong and Shimin were indeed tired. Their bodies were tired and so were their fingers. The blood that flowed from their fingers stained the zither and the flute. Even the sounds of the zither and the flute began to become hoarse. But their hearts were not tired. At least at this moment, their hearts were firm and strong enough. Beigong Weiyang's fingers suddenly stopped. He raised his head and looked at the endless cavalrymen of the Allied army charging over from the plains. He smiled. Then, with a clear whistle, he flicked his wrist. His bleeding fingers stroked the strings of the zither from back to front, his movements extremely elegant. The clear sound of a zither rang out like spring water. When Shimin Buhua heard the real sound of the zither, a resolute smile appeared on his face. The flute suddenly burst forth with a real and bright sound, like that of a shepherd boy blowing leaves. At this moment, the zither and flute were no longer playing soundless music, but real music. The spring water gurgled, gradually turning into a golden strike. The shepherd boy blew the leaves, which gradually turned into a mournful wail. The sound of the zither and flute carried an indomitable and heroic aura, spreading to the wilderness. It was a golden dagger axe, an iron horse. The violent sound of the zither and flute caused the charging warhorses to go berserk. For the cavalrymen of the Divine Hall and South Jin Kingdom who were riding on the warhorses, the music was like countless sharp knives, directly stabbing into their brains. Several cavalrymen at the forefront cried out in pain and fell off their horses. Their feet were dragged by the stirrups, and their bodies were dragged forward in the wilderness. After a while they were covered in blood and many bones were broken. Their hands were clearly empty, but they didn't untie their feet. They just tightly covered their ears. To them, the pain brought by the sound of the zither and flute was countless times greater than the pain of broken bones and torn flesh being dragged forward by the warhorses. When more cavalrymen heard the sound of the zither and flute, their faces suddenly turned pale. They instinctively threw away all the weapons that should not have left their hands, and then covered their ears tightly. Even so, they still could not stop the sound of the zither and flute. It was like the whisper of Yama, drilling into their ears and deep into their minds, cutting their consciousness into countless painful pieces. Howls, screams, and cries of pain rang out continuously in the wilderness. The originally disciplined cavalrymen all became crazy at this moment. They covered their ears, their faces twisted in pain. Under such circumstances, the cavalrymen naturally could not lead the charge. The warhorses, who had lost their commanders, stopped jumping uneasily and paced back and forth in the wilderness, looking especially terrified and lost. The zither and flute were silent earlier because it was used against the horses. At this moment, Beigong Weiyang and Shimen Buhuo were finally angry. The sound of the zither and flute gradually appeared and began to be used against the people. The moment the sound of the zither and flute sounded, the expressions of the academy disciples under the canopy suddenly changed. This was because they knew very well what kind of price Beigong and Shimen Buhuo had to pay for this kind of music. Fourth brother reached out and wanted to stop Beigong from playing the zither, but seeing his waving wet black hair and his crazy and carefree expression, he could not bear to stop him. Outside the verdant canyon, there was a semicircle of 1,000 feet. Second brother stood inside. Outside the semicircle, countless cavalrymen of the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army were lying on the ground. It was like the famous breakwater by the storm sea of the Kingdom of Song, but this black breakwater was filled with screams and cries of pain. Countless warhorses fell to the ground and died. Countless cavalrymen were crushed to death by the heavy warhorses. Countless horses and cavalrymen were still alive, but their flesh was broken and they were better off dead than alive. One could vaguely see cotton balls stuffed in the ears of some of the horses and cavalrymen. But it was obvious that these cotton balls did not have the desired effect. They were stained with red blood, probably because their eardrums had been shattered. This was an extremely tragic scene. Over the past countless years, there had been countless tragic wars in this world, but rarely had such a scene appeared. And all of this was because of a zither and a flute. Even the academy disciples under the canopy could not bear to see this scene. Second brother, who was standing at the forefront and closest to the corpses of the cavalrymen, had no expression on his face. His expression was still calm and his eyebrows were still straight. The West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army's cavalry was still trying to charge towards the verdant canyon. However, the terrain was filled with the corpses of their comrades and warhorses, and it was difficult to find a gap. At this moment, a muffled sound came from the pile of corpses. A burly general from the South Jin Kingdom shouted and pushed away the corpses on him. He held an iron spear with both hands and rushed towards second brother. Behind him, there were still a few powerhouses who were not knocked down by the sound of the zither and flute. When they heard the shout, they stepped on their saddles and flew into the air, attacking second brother like flying stones. The general from the South Jin Kingdom was the most powerful and arrived the fastest. The iron spear in his hand stabbed out violently, forming a straight line in the air and forcing all the air out. The tip of the spear exploded with a thunderous sound. Second brother reached out expressionlessly and held the hilt of the iron sword. Then he smashed it down on the general from the South Jin Kingdom. It was not a chop, a hack, a cut, or a slice. It was a smash. The iron sword was square and wide, looking like a very thick piece of iron. When second brother held it in his hand and smashed it forward, a strong wind blew and the gravel on the ground rolled away in fear. The iron sword smashed onto the tip of the iron spear. The tip of the iron spear was smashed flat. The iron sword continued to smash down. The body of the iron spear was smashed and bent. The iron sword did not stop smashing down as if it would never stop. The iron sword smashed onto the body of the general from the South Jin Kingdom. The armor on the general from the South Jin Kingdom was instantly shattered into countless pieces. Second senior brother ignored him and looked up at the martial arts experts who were flying through the air. He shook his right arm and swung the iron sword from left to right. This time it was not a smash but a slap. A slap like a fly. Those martial arts experts who were like flying stones were turned into real stones when they came into contact with the sword wind of the iron sword. They flew far into the wilderness and landed heavily on the ground. After a while, the few powerhouses stood up with their swords as support. The general from the South Jin Kingdom held the bent iron spear in his hand again. Second brother looked at him expressionlessly. The eyes of the general from the South Jin Kingdom revealed a look of despair and disbelief. With a puff, he spat out all the blood in his chest and abdomen. Then he collapsed like a water bag that had been emptied. He fell to the ground, paralyzed. All the bones in the general's body were smashed by the iron sword. The few powerhouses in the distance also fell one after another. They were also broken. Second brother was covered in blood. It was all the enemy's blood. The blood dripped down along the edge of the armor and gradually converged into a stream of blood. It flowed to the 5 swords that were stuck in the field and then slowly seeped down along the place where the swords pierced. The swords were his trophies. The blood was also his trophies. He did not know how many swords he would plant in front of him in this battle of Verdant Canyon and how many enemies' blood he would use to water them. He did not care about the blood on his body and only looked at the field in front of him quietly. Because the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition army was still attacking. This was really a boring battle. Killing and then still killing. The hoofbeats of the warhorses were monotonous. The screams of the coalition cavalry were monotonous. The no longer beautiful flute and zither were monotonous too. The so-called monotonous was repetition. The sun in the sky gradually moved to the west and gradually turned red. The light that shone on the field also became much redder and warmer. On the field outside the Verdant Canyon, there were countless corpses. The screams of the corpses gradually subsided and the surroundings were deathly silent. The field in the dusk seemed to be smeared with blood. In fact, it was smeared with blood too. From noon to dusk, the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition army had filled in at least 1,000 cavalrymen. The zither and flute never stopped playing. Because Beigong and Shimin knew very well that as long as the zither and flute did not stop, second brother could not move. Second brother indeed did not move. He did not move. He still stood where he was. He did not take a step back. Because behind him was the Verdant Canyon. Behind the Verdant Canyon was the Tang Empire. Suddenly the sound of gongs rang in the south of the field. The West Hill Divine Palace Coalition army finally called the cavalry to stop charging. It was not that they could not bear the loss. It was that the soldiers of the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition army felt very tired. The disciples of the academy were very tired. They were very tired. The Divine Hall Coalition army was very tired in their hearts. This kind of tiredness was called fear. But there were also people who never knew what fear was. Ning Ke had always thought that she was very suitable to study in the academy. A blood-red figure appeared in the field in the dusk. Yi Hongyu's voice rang in the field. Junimo, fight with me. Second brother looked at the blood-red robe in the south that seemed to be burning in the dusk. You are no match for me. After saying this, he carried his iron sword and walked to the exit of the Verdant Canyon. At the exit of the Verdant Canyon, there were broken arrows on the roof like grass. Under the roof, water was boiling in a pot on the stove. The water was about to boil. It was time for dinner. Cool. I finally got the feeling back. 2 wolf howls. 2 chapters tomorrow. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 750. Yi Hongyu stood in the field and looked at the back of the figure walking into the tent. She was silent for a long time with mixed emotions in her eyes. Then she turned around and walked back to the sacred sedan. As the sun set, the cavalry returned to camp. The music of the zither and flute in the Verdant Canyon gradually faded away. Beigong Weiyang and Shimin Buhua stopped playing, but they were still immersed in the previous atmosphere. Excitement, pleasure, and exhaustion mixed together until they were woken up by a heavy slap. Fourth brother glanced at Wang Qi and signaled him to be ready. Then he stretched out his palm and hit Beigong and Shimin heavily on their backs. Beigong and Shimin felt a sharp pain in their chests and spat out blood. They were confused and didn't have time to question their senior brother angrily when Wang Qi stuffed 2 pills into their mouths. A refreshing medicinal aura instantly pervaded their chests and abdomens, sweeping away all the irritated and manic feelings from before. The 2 of them felt much more comfortable, and only then did they understand why their senior brother wanted to hit them. You can't hold on for long if you fight like this. Fourth brother said, have a good rest tonight. Beigong Weiyang said, thank you for your help, senior brother. Fourth brother said, my slap is not the key. 11's medicine is the real good stuff. Wang Qi loved thinking, flowers, and healing people since he was a child. He didn't dare to say that his medical skills were unparalleled, but the medicine he developed was definitely the rarest in the world. Hearing his senior brother's praises, he shook his head in embarrassment. Just then, second brother walked into the tent. Everyone hurried forward and helped sixth senior brother remove the heavy armor on his body. Everyone thought of how Yi Hongyu had challenged him to a battle, and how senior brother had only said that she was no match for him before asking her to step down. They all praised senior brother's elegance. Second brother said calmly, that girl is powerful. It will take some effort to defeat her. It's better not to fight if you can talk to her. Everyone was speechless when they realized that senior brother actually had such a thought when he turned around. Seventh sister thought mockingly, so you are not as stupid as you usually appear. The pill quickly dissolved in his body. Beigong Weiyang felt that his spirit and psyche power had recovered. He said, let's have a good night's sleep and fight them tomorrow. Shimin Buhua was still excited and said, "That's right." No one answered them. Beigong Weiyang looked haggard and his fingers were all injured. Shimen Buhua was waving his hands in front of him, still maintaining the posture of playing the flute. He looked like a chicken's feet, funny and pitiful. Everyone could tell that if they were to risk their lives again they might really lose their lives. "You guys have worked hard today. Let me do it tomorrow." Second senior brother patted Beigong and Shimen's shoulders. Beigong's body suddenly stiffened. Shimen's mouth opened and his eyes became wet. Second brother frowned slightly and asked, "What's wrong?" Beigong sighed and didn't say anything. Shimen Buhua wiped away his tears and said emotionally, "Senior brother, after so many years in the sect, this is the first time you praise me." Second brother was silent for a moment and then said seriously, "I will praise you more in the future." Seventh sister looked at Shimen Buhua's chicken claws and said jokingly, "I will stew chicken claws for you tonight." Shimen Buhua asked in confusion, "Why stew chicken claws?" Seventh sister held back her laughter and said seriously, "To make up for it." Shimen Buhua smiled bitterly and said, "Wouldn't that make it worse?" A burst of laughter rang out at the exit of the verdant canyon. The water was boiling and the rice was ready. Seventh sister began to prepare dinner. The people from the back of the mountain of the academy had prepared for this trip to the verdant canyon. They had brought enough rice and salted vegetables. They also had a ready-made stove. It was not difficult for her and Wang Qi to cook together. In the southern wilderness, the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition army began to pack up and cook. It seemed that today's battle had come to an end. Smoke rose everywhere and the atmosphere finally calmed down. However, the atmosphere at the exit of the verdant canyon became solemn. Second brother was the leader and the disciples stood behind him. They looked at the endless supply wagons in the south and their expressions became very ugly. The people who transported the food to the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition army were from the warlords of Qinghe County. The food must have been stored in Qinghe County. Not long ago it was the food of the Tang Empire. Beigong Weiyang said sternly, "One day we will kill all these traitors." Shimen Buhua said in a low voice, "All the warlords must die." The two of them came from the southernmost island and were not born and raised in the Tang Empire. However, after living in the academy for so many years, they had long regarded themselves as Tangs. They were even angrier than fourth brother and the others. Fourth brother held the sand table and calculated for a moment. He said, "If we want to reclaim Qinghe County in the future, we have to kill at least 200,000 people to wipe out the warlords. Only then can we truly vent our anger." Hearing that they had to kill 200,000 people, Beigong and Shimen Buhua's expressions suddenly froze. They were refined scholars who had dedicated their lives to music. In their entire lives they had never even killed a chicken. Even though more than 1,000 heavy cavalry had died to the sound of their zither and flute, they truly could not imagine doing something like massacring others with blood. It was quiet under the canopy. The disciples of the academy guarded the verdant canyon for Chang'an and the Tang Empire. They did not care how many people they had to kill. However, if there was a day in the future when they had to raise their butcher's knife, Beigong suddenly laughed and said, "Isn't there still youngest brother?" Shimen Buhua suddenly understood and said, that's right. Youngest brother is best at this kind of thing." Fourth brother and sixth brother also nodded. They thought to themselves, if the academy wanted to kill all over the world, who else but youngest brother could do it? Second brother did not speak. Wang Qi said by the chopping board, "The cold dish is ready. Did you bring any sesame?" Second brother said, "Let's eat." At this moment, everyone suddenly smelled a faint burning smell. Seventh sister shouted and hurried to the stove. She saw that the rice had been burnt. Beigong Weiyang looked at the burnt rice and sighed. When headmaster took eldest brother on a trip, the food in the back of the mountain was not good. Shimen Buhua said with nostalgia, when Sang Sang was in the academy, everyone ate the best. No one blamed seventh sister, but she felt very uneasy. The array outside the verdant canyon had been completed. Compared with second brother and the other brothers, her main job was to take care of the logistics. It was very easy, but she still failed to do it well. After a moment, her uneasiness turned into anger. She said angrily, "Sixth brother, this stove is used to forge iron and swords. The temperature is too high. How can it be suitable for cooking?" Second brother raised his eyebrows and said unhappily, "That's unreasonable and rude." Seventh sister was startled and said angrily, "If you think my cooking is not good, then don't eat it." After a simple meal, those who needed to rest rested and those who needed to prepare for tomorrow began to prepare. Fourth brother said, "Pamela was under a lot of psychological pressure, so she was a little embarrassed. When you scolded her, she felt even more wronged, so she yelled at you. Don't blame her. Second brother frowned slightly and said, "Why did she feel wronged?" Fourth brother said, "She was worried about you, so she lost her composure. In the end, she was even scolded by you. She felt wronged." Second brother was slightly startled. After a long silence, he said, "That's not necessary." Fourth brother stopped talking about this because the disciples of the back of the mountain of the academy had been discussing this matter in private for several years, but they had never come to a conclusion. He turned to look at the entrance of the verdant canyon behind the tent. Looking at the faintly discernible stones inside, he said, "If the divine hall is not prepared, we should still guard in the canyon. It will save us energy." Second brother said, "Everything must be done safely. That is the biggest mistake. Today's battle is clear, but the divine hall keeps sending out cavalry. They want to force us into the canyon. Although I don't know what they will do after entering the verdant canyon, I don't want to retreat until the last moment." "Why?" "Because as long as we retreat one step, we may retreat many more steps." Fourth brother turned around and looked at the dark camp of the Allied army in the southern wilderness, saying, "I'm more worried about whether the other party will launch a night attack." Second brother looked up at the bright moon in the night sky and said, "With the teacher watching from the sky, they won't dare to do that." Unknowingly, the other disciples also came out from the tent and stood behind the two senior brothers. They looked up at the bright moon in the night sky, each with nostalgia. "Is it really the teacher?" Wuxia asked. Second brother said, "Maybe." Sixth brother was not as sentimental as the other disciples. He was used to thinking about simple and realistic problems. He said, "Firewood is a problem. If we want to go into the canyon to collect firewood, we will be easily attacked." Second brother pointed to the field outside the tent. There were dense arrows like a wheat field and said, "There is firewood everywhere." Unlike the entrance of the verdant canyon, which was sometimes lively and sometimes sad, the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army camp was filled with frustration and depression. It was very quiet. Bai Haixin drank a cup of wine and ate 2 bowls of rice. Then he signaled his subordinates to remove the table. Then he walked out of the tent and looked at the green mountains under the moonlight. He frowned and fell into a long silence. He was the commander of the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army, but in fact he was not even in the top 5. How could he dare to give orders to the 2 great divine priests of West Hill and the sage of sword Liu Bai? This was his distress. He did not know what the bigwigs of the divine hall were thinking. He did not understand why they had to sacrifice so many cavalrymen just to force the academy into the verdant canyon. Since they were going to guard the main road, it was naturally more suitable to guard in the canyon. What he did not understand was why the academy would rather fight with the army in the field than take a few steps back and enter the verdant canyon. A priest in red walked over and handed him a piece of paper. Bai Haixin looked at it and frowned even more. He thought, "Are we going to continue to die tomorrow? Let all the martial arts cultivators from the cultivation sects and the army come to the tent." Looking back at the Winter Lake, it is the 2nd volume. I found that it is really well written. There is still one more chapter. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 751. The Allied Army's tent was really big. Even with hundreds of people sitting there, it still didn't seem crowded. Moreover, those people were very quiet, so the spacious tent actually felt a little more quiet. "This is an order from the Great Divine Seat." Bai Haixin looked at the people who were resisting with silence and said indifferently, "Don't think about the glory and respect you enjoy in the sects and the human world. You should know that we are in the army now. We are fighting against the Tang Empire. We are carrying out the will of Haotian." A cultivator in the see-through realm stared at him and said sternly, "Even the heavy cavalry can't break through. What can we do? Who can withstand the sound of the zither and the flute?" Bai Haixin said, "Since I want you to abandon your horses and fight, then you don't have to worry about your mounts. As for the sound of the zither and the flute, the Revelation Divine Palace is making talismans now, and they will be distributed to you later. I don't want to hear any more questions. What you need to do now is to accept." Without waiting for the usually arrogant cultivators to object, he continued expressionlessly, "What ordinary soldiers can't do, of course, has to be carried out by you. Otherwise, why would Taoism pay for you?" An angry voice came from the back of the crowd, "Aren't you sending us to our deaths?" Bai Haixin's face suddenly turned cold. Looking at the source of the voice, he asked, "Who's talking?" No one answered, no one dared to answer, and no one dared to speak again. At this time, there were hundreds of military powerhouses and cultivators from various sects in the tent. Usually, even if Bai Haixin was the general of the South Jin Kingdom, He would not make them keep quiet. However, they were in the Divine Hall Coalition army. Everyone knew that Bai Haixin's words represented the West Hill Divine Palace. Not daring to speak did not mean not thinking. The cultivators' faces darkened. They all knew that the man was right. The West Hill Divine Palace wanted to send these small vassal sects to their deaths. They wanted to use their own deaths to consume the psyche power and physical strength of the Academy's disciples. Think about your sect. Do you want it to last for a long time, or do you want it to disappear like fireworks? Think about your family and disciples that you left behind in your hometown, and think about the great existence above the heavens. After saying this, Bai Haixin turned around and left the tent. There was dead silence in the tent. Silence represented acceptance. They had no choice but to accept it. Compared to the warm atmosphere in the verdant canyon, it was cold here. The rolling green mountains blocked the warm water vapor from the great swamp in the south. Qinghe Prefecture had always been known for its spring-like seasons, but it was already late autumn. After night fell, the temperature in the wilderness gradually dropped. A bonfire was lit in the barracks. The stars in the night sky were obscured by the silver glow of the bright moon. At this time, they were illuminated by the countless bonfires in the wilderness, making them even more indistinct. If one did not look carefully, one would even think that there were no stars in the night sky. More than 20 people sat around a bonfire. They were all disciples of the Sword Garret of South Jin Kingdom. All the disciples surrounded a man with extremely respectful expressions. The man was dressed in linen clothes and had his hair combed into a simple bun. His face was ordinary, but his eyebrows were very special. They were so thick that they seemed to be drawn with an ink brush. On the ground beside him there was an old golden crown. In this world only emperors could wear a golden crown. This man was not the emperor of any country. He was the emperor of the Way of the Sword, a saint of the Way of the Sword. He was Liu Bai, so the golden crown was beside him. The Divine Hall's idea will definitely not work. Liu Bai looked at the bright moon in the night sky and was silent for a long time. The disciples did not dare to ask any questions. They waited for the teacher to continue. It seems very stupid for the few people from the academy to stop an army of tens of thousands, but they are not. So it will not work if the Divine Hall wants to use up Jun Mo's strength. Lu Yiqing coughed twice in pain and said, Mr. Second is powerful, but he is limited. Moreover, with his arrogant and domineering fighting style, it will be difficult for him to hold on for too long. Today he had suffered another crushing defeat at the hands of the academy disciples and was seriously injured. However, he was not as angry and sad as before. He was still calm enough to analyze the situation. The Divine Hall thinks just like you. So it's all the same. Liu Bai said, You all think that Jun Mo is arrogant and domineering, so every time he uses his sword, he consumes more psyche power and energy and cannot last long. That's ridiculous. Jun Mo's iron sword, whether it's smashing or patting, seems to be more laborious than chopping, but it's not the case. That's because you don't understand that when you use your sword to chop, you use your strength to wear out the edge of the sword. But when he smashes and pats, he uses the heaven and earth's yuan qi. If you want to wear out that thick iron sword, I'm afraid you'll have to wait until the end of time. After saying this, the world's top swordsman took out a thin branch from the bonfire that had not yet burned. He slowly raised it to a foot in front of his eyebrows and then casually waved it down. The qi of heaven and earth around the bonfire moved with the waving of the branch. Several wisps of thin qi stuck to the tip of the branch and became thicker and thicker as he waved it, until it finally condensed into a ball. Liu Bai's branch finally fell into the bonfire. The ball of qi of heaven and earth that condensed in front of the branch dissipated when it met the fire. The bonfire burst into flames with a bang, and the flames reached 30 feet into the night sky, brightening up the military camp. There was an exclamation around, but after a while, it gradually subsided. Lu Yiqing lowered his head and thought silently for a long time. His eyes could not see, but his psyche power could clearly feel what the branch was doing. Mr. Second doesn't need strength to wield the sword. He uses the qi of heaven and earth to wield the sword, and in turn mobilizes the qi of heaven and earth to help the sword momentum. This is not a martial arts practice, nor is it a method of the devil's doctrine, but different means lead to the same goal. He suddenly raised his head and looked at the verdant canyon where he could not see, and said in a trembling voice, This kind of swordsmanship consumes the least psyche power and physical strength, so he can keep killing. Your view is both right and wrong. Liu Bai threw the remaining half of the branch into the bonfire and said, You're right because you said what Jun Mo did when he wielded the sword. You're wrong because you haven't understood that he is not using the qi of heaven and earth to wield the sword. He is using the chi of heaven and earth to beat people. It was quiet around the bonfire. More than 20 disciples of the sword Garrett were silent, each with their own thoughts. They had followed the world's strongest cultivator and practiced swordsmanship hard, so they were proud of their swordsmanship. That was why they were always dissatisfied with the academy and disliked Mr. Second's pride. But now they understood that he had his own reasons for being proud. Lu Bai asked, "Where has Jun Mo's iron sword been?" A disciple thought for a while and said uncertainly, "The iron sword was in front of him when he was not holding the sword." Lu Bai asked, "How far in front of him?" No one paid attention to this detail. Lu Bai said, "Only I will pay attention to this detail because this is what Jun Mo wanted me to see. The iron sword has always been 1.5 feet in front of him." Everyone was surprised. Everyone knew that the sage of sword Lu Bai's most famous sword Taoism philosophy was that the sword could not reach 1 foot in front of him. 1.5 feet was longer than 1 foot. So 1.5 feet in front of him was stronger than 1 foot in front of him? Lu Bai knew his disciples' mood at this time, so he smiled and said, "Cultivators must be confident, so pride is the most common external manifestation. I have seen many proud people in my life, such as Yi Su and the dead old man of judgment, but I have never seen anyone more proud than Jun Mo." The disciples were silent. "And pride is the way to his death." Lu Bai stopped smiling and said indifferently, "Because pride is an emotion. A real swordsman cannot have any unnecessary emotions." A disciple finally could not help but ask, "When are you going to fight?" "The divine hall is anxious but I am not. The Tang Empire will not be destroyed in one battle." Lu Bai said, "This battle of Verdant Canyon is a great opportunity for you to learn from the academy. Jun Mo is also my favorite opponent. As I said earlier, I will definitely wait until he is at his strongest before making a move." The disciples thought that Mr. Second had guarded the Verdant Canyon with his sword and did not retreat a single step. He was already extremely powerful and even invincible. Could he become even stronger? Lu Yiqing asked, "When will Mr. Second be at his strongest?" "Jun Mo is an ordinary person, so he will behave like an ordinary person. That is why he spared your lives today. But when he holds his sword, he is no longer an ordinary person. When he starts to get injured, when he starts to get tired, when he discovers that his pride has been provoked, and when he starts to become truly angry, when everyone thinks that he is going to fail, that is when he is at his strongest." Lu Bai stood up and looked at the quiet Verdant Canyon across the field. He felt the warm aura coming from there and slowly put his hands behind his back. He did not speak for a long time. The disciples of the sword Garrett also stood up and looked in that direction, not knowing what he was looking at. The army is vast and powerful, but they are still in the mood to cook in the face of danger. Well, the rice is a little burnt but the pickles taste good. The night wind blew gently. Lu Bai smelled the scent in the wind and said with emotion, "This is life. Neither war nor killing can affect the process. This is life." Why are the disciples of the academy so calm? It is not because they are confident, but because they are doing what they want to do and doing what makes them happy. So they take it for granted. My sword can take it for granted, but I can't live like them. Lu Bai looked at the Verdant Canyon and said with a smile, "The academy is really a magical place. It is a pity that the headmaster is gone. Otherwise I would like to live there for a few years." The second day of the Battle of Verdant Canyon. The sky was gloomy and it seemed to rain. The smell of blood in the field was getting stronger. The millet porridge in the pot was also very fragrant. Everyone praised the pickles Sang Sang had made in the back of the mountain years ago and began to eat the porridge. They drank with great vigor. After finishing the porridge, they helped second brother put on his armor. Second brother walked to the field with his iron sword in hand. Seventh sister did not sleep well last night. She rubbed her tired eyes and said, "Be careful." Today she was full of porridge. Everything was fine. I recommend a book called God of Heaven, book number 2507930. It was written by an old acquaintance. Please support it. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 752. It was still early and the morning light was dim. The field in front of the Green Mountain was covered with mist, and the light was dim. The dew on the grass reflected the light like black pearls. There were 5 swords in the field. They were the swords that second brother had taken from the disciples of the sword Garrett yesterday. He did not stand in front of the 5 swords like he did yesterday. Instead he walked around them. The Battle of Verdant Canyon had lasted for a whole day. Instead of retreating, he took a step forward. Suddenly, a shout came from the depths of the mist. Liang Xiang of Sanqing Mountain is here to learn from you. Sanqing Mountain was a famous Taoism sect in the southeast. It was just that the Lank Temple was too famous these years, so it was relatively unknown. In fact, there were many powerhouses in the sect. Liang Xiang was the most talented and most powerful young disciple in Sanqing Mountain. He was deeply loved by the elders of the sect, and even the West Hill Divine Palace paid attention to him. He was very confident in his swordsmanship. After receiving the military order from the West Hill Divine Palace last night, he was not as sad as other cultivators. On the contrary, he was very excited. He wanted to see if Mr. Second of the Academy could take his sword. So his voice was very confident and proud. Following this voice was a flying sword that overflowed with brilliant lights. The sharp and narrow blade was like an arrow as it easily pierced through the air and thin mist, whistling over. Second brother looked into the depths of the mist without any emotion. Without looking at the flying sword, he stretched out his right hand. There was a tearing sound in the mist. It was like countless pieces of paper being torn into countless pieces by powerful fingers. The aura of heaven and earth in front of the verdant canyon was torn apart along with the sound. The flying sword dragged a wisp of chi of heaven and earth and naturally broke apart with the tearing everywhere. There was a painful muffled sound in the mist. The whistling flying sword suddenly lost control and slowly descended. It fell into second brother's hand. Second brother held the flying sword and threw it behind him casually. With a bang, the sharp flying sword was deeply inserted into the slightly wet ground of the field. It stood side by side with the 5 flying swords from last night. The morning light gradually brightened, and the mist suddenly disappeared. The scene in the field became clear. A young Taoist priest stood there in a daze. His hands were empty and his chest was covered in blood. Looking at his expression, he seemed to be scared silly. He was Liang Xiang, the pride of Mount Sanqing. 2 disciples of Mount Sanqing stepped forward to hold his arms to prevent him from falling to the ground. Only then did Liang Xiang come to his senses. He let out an extremely terrified scream. Yesterday, when he saw the Sword Garret disciples' flying sword being taken away, he mocked the South Jin Kingdom people for not living up to their name. But now, when he saw his natal sword being taken away, he finally understood how it felt. How could such a thing happen? How did that man do it? Why didn't the sect elders teach them? His fellow disciples dragged Liang Xiang back to the south of the field. He stared at the gloomy sky in a daze and let out a few strange and miserable howls from time to time. His Taoist heart had been completely destroyed. Second senior brother did not notice these details. He had even forgotten where that proud young Taoist cultivator came from and what his name was. More and more cultivators appeared in the field, including dozens of military powerhouses who had obviously been immersed in martial arts for many years. They did not ride horses and all had fu papers on their bodies. Was this the West Hill Divine Palace's response? Second senior brother raised his broad and straight iron sword and pointed it at the densely packed cultivators. He put his left hand behind his back. The people from the academy under the canopy saw his action and knew that he was ordering them not to move. Since the West Hill Divine Palace was prepared, there was no need to play the zither and flute for the time being. The second cultivator to attack the verdant canyon was a rogue cultivator from Shaodong Mountain. This rogue cultivator cultivated in martial arts. He had been fighting with lions and tigers in the mountains for many years to improve his cultivation. If he was willing to join the army, he could be a general in the South Jin Kingdom, the Song Kingdom, and the Qi Kingdom. However, his life goal was to become the commander of the Divine Guards of the West Hill Divine Palace. That was why he had never left the mountain. It was not until the Divine Hall issued an edict against the Tang Empire that he finally had a chance. As long as he could show his powerful strength in this war, he would naturally be noticed by the Divine Hall. That was what the rogue cultivator thought and what he did. He raised the heavy broadsword that had killed all the lions and tigers in Shaodong Mountain and roared. His feet stepped on the ground like an earth dragon and he rushed toward the verdant canyon with an unstoppable force. This itinerant cultivator's speed was so fast that even the air was buzzing from the vibrations. The cultivators in the field only saw a blur in front of them. The rogue cultivator had already rushed to the front of second senior brother and chopped down with his broadsword. Second senior brother's face was still expressionless. He raised his broad and straight iron sword and waved it. The edge of the armor that covered his whole body had a trace of his sleeve exposed. When he waved the sword, the sleeve did not even tremble. Just as Liu Bai had explained to the disciples last night, when second senior brother waved the sword, he did not use his own strength, but the power of heaven and earth. Therefore his movement was very natural. His movement was natural. It was like he waved his sleeve. It did not stir up any clouds, but it swept up all the aura of heaven and earth in front of the verdant canyon. His arm and the iron sword followed the aura of heaven and earth. He used his heart but not his strength. The iron sword and the rogue cultivator's broadsword met in the air. The blade that had once killed lions and tigers was as small and fragile as a piece of paper in front of heaven and earth. With a cracking sound, the heavy broadsword shattered into countless pieces. The iron sword continued to move forward and seemed to hit the rogue cultivator's chest gently and calmly. There was a loud bang. The rogue cultivator's burly body suddenly flew into the air. After flying for dozens of feet, he fell heavily on the ground, creating a deep pit. After a moment, a violent and unwilling roar came from the pit. The rogue cultivator threw away the hilt in his hand and angrily crawled out of the pit. Then he fell back into the pit. He roared and crawled again. He fell back into the pit again. He did it 5 times. Finally, the rogue cultivator could not crawl anymore and fell to the bottom of the pit in confusion. There was a sound. He began to vomit blood. The blood was black and even some pieces of internal organs could be seen in it. The power of the iron sword had penetrated into this man's incomparably strong body and directly shattered his internal organs. The rogue cultivator did not even notice it until he tried to stand up 5 times. The vibration made his internal organs, which had been covered with countless cracks, all cracked. Just like the seemingly powerful broadsword. Next, it was not one person who attacked the verdant canyon. It was not one sword either. It was more than 20 swords. More than 20 flying swords from cultivators of various sects from various countries. In the field shrouded in the dark sky, only the shrill sound of the swords could be heard. The swords were like rainbows and actually became bright. These people were all great sword masters in the see-through realm. There were not many cultivators in the world and even fewer in the see-through realm. Only the Tang Empire and the West Hill Divine Palace could have the ability to organize so many great sword masters on a battlefield. The scene of more than 20 flying swords roaring and dancing was extremely rare. Even a powerhouse at the peak of the knowing destiny state would find it difficult to face such an attack. Second brother did not feel that it was difficult. He just felt that it was a little troublesome because he only had 2 hands. Looking at the more than 20 flying swords breaking through the air, he inserted the iron sword into the soil in front of him and stretched out his hands to catch the swords casually. Because his movements were too fast, it seemed a little messy. Only countless crisp sounds could be heard. More than 20 flying swords were all caught in his hands. His palms were not big. No one knew how he could catch so many swords. Those flying swords were held in his hands in a disorderly manner, like a really proud peacock who was too proud to dress up. It was really messy for a moment when it woke up and casually spread its tail to dry its wings. Then he threw these flying swords behind him. Those swords were inserted into the soft and wet field. The Haoyan Taoism sect ruled the world. Even the sage of sword Liu Bai and the master of calligrapher Lord Wang were guests. No one knew how many cultivators were its vassals. This battle of the Verdant Canyon was undoubtedly the battle with the largest number of cultivators in 100 years. Countless cultivators and the powerhouses of the coalition army surged across the field and attacked the Verdant Canyon like waves, slapping towards the silent man standing in front of the Verdant Canyon. No matter how many of their companions fell, the people behind continued. This was what it meant to be wave after wave. However, the successors still could not take a step forward and could only fall to the ground. Dozens of arms flew into the sky with blood. Dozens of corpses were thrown into the distance. Countless flying swords pierced through the air and then turned into scrap metal in the hands of the man. Yesterday, there were tens of thousands of arrows stuck in the field in front of the Verdant Canyon. It was an arrow forest. The vibration of the chi of heaven and earth caused by today's battle had already shattered those arrows into pieces. What replaced them were more than 100 flying swords stuck deep in the field. Those flying swords had different styles and auras. Some were wide, some were narrow, some were sharp, and some were blunt. But when they were inserted into the ground, they became no different. They were all so lifeless. It was a sword forest, more like a sword grave. Second brother stood in front of the sword grave, occasionally waving his iron sword. He stood at the very beginning and did not move a single step. His eyebrows were still flat, not even raised for a moment. He did not show anything shocking. He just calmly and silently waved his iron sword. From the first strike until now, there was no change in the posture, angle, or strength of the sword. He did not seem to know what tiredness was. From early morning to noon he was so focused on every strike, so he seemed so casual. It seemed that even if he killed until dusk he would not change. His body was covered with blood. The places where the blood flowed through the armor did not change, and the places where the blood dripped from the edge of the armor did not change. So the field in front of him was smashed by the blood, leaving a few clear blood pits. He was just like he had been in the past years, meticulous in both his posture and expression. Meticulous in killing. The more he did so, the more frightening it was and the more chilling it was. The crisscrossing sword intent in the field gradually became sparse. Many cultivators were consumed by fear and subconsciously stopped attacking. Suddenly a cry sounded in the crowd. No one knew which sect the cultivator was from, but he was so scared that he cried. No one thought of laughing at that person. Because looking at the iron sword that was dripping with blood, everyone wanted to cry very much. That's all for today. There may be fewer updates in the next few days, because the end of the year is approaching. I have to pick up my in-laws when they come back tomorrow, and I have a lot of things to do. Then there will be fewer updates in February. Because of the new year, there will be fewer updates. In order to avoid people saying that I will cross after crossing, I will increase the number of updates every month in March and make it clear before the month to avoid pressure and commitment. Another thing I want to report to everyone is about the annual selection, which is mainly the selection of the alliance leader. Although F and Old K may not really care about this, they are now in the top 10 of the alliance leader selection. I hope that everyone who has votes in their hands can support them. I would like to take this opportunity to thank everyone for their kindness and generosity over the past year. I won't say much else. I will write a good book to repay everyone. Thank you for your hard work. In addition, I still like Junimo the most, so I will write more about this part. I have been holding back for a long time just to write about the Battle of Verdant Canyon. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 753. In front of the Verdant Canyon, the sword chi was everywhere. It was dead silent in the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army camp in the south. The great divine priest of Revelation put down the veil and said slowly, I have never seen anyone kill like this in my life. Mr. Ku was probably like this when he joined the Devil's Doctrine. Cheng Lishua knelt beside the sacred sedan and did not know what to say. It was quiet inside and outside the sacred sedan. After a long time, there was a sudden exclamation outside the sedan and then a tsunami of cheers. The voices of the coalition army were full of surprise and joy. Cheng Lishua suddenly looked out of the sacred sedan and asked anxiously, Did he win? His voice trembled because he was very nervous. A priest in red came to the side of the sacred sedan and panted, Not yet. Cheng Lishua's expression changed slightly and asked, Then why are they cheering? The priest in red said excitedly, He changed his hand. He is now holding the sword with his left hand. Cheng Lishua frowned and asked confusedly, So what? The priest in red said happily, It means that he will also be tired. He won't be able to hold on for long. Cheng Lishua's body was a bit stiff. He wanted to say something but did not say anything in the end. He just waved his hand to let the priest in red leave with a bitter smile on his face. As long as he was human, he would be tired. Mr. Second was also a human. But that man had only changed the iron sword to his left hand and made them so excited. It could be imagined how much psychological pressure and panic he caused in front of the Verdant Canyon. It was still quiet in the other sacred sedan. Yi Hongyu lowered her eyes and put her jade-like hands on the bloody divine robe of judgment. She was silent. The cheers outside the sacred sedan did not change her expression. No subordinates dared to disturb her meditation with those absurd reasons. After a while, the coalition army suddenly burst into cheers again. The subordinates of the Divine Hall of Judgment finally could not suppress their emotions. A deacon in black walked up the sacred sedan and knelt outside the veil. He reported respectfully, The flying sword of Taoist Chui from the kingdom of Song stabbed him. Hearing this, Yi Hongyu's expression finally changed. Because she knew who Priest Chui was. Even she had some hope for Taoist Chui. She raised her head and looked at the black deacon, asking, And then? The black-robed deacon was slightly startled. It seemed that he didn't expect the great divine priest to ask another question. He answered nervously, Then? Priest Chui's Taoist sword was broken, but that person seemed to be fine. Yi Hongyu frowned slightly and said, Then what do you want to tell me? The black-robed deacon became more and more nervous. His voice trembled as he said, This is the first time someone has been able to stab that person with a sword. This means that that person can still be stabbed. Although it's stupid, there's some truth to it. Yi Hongyu looked at the Verdant Canyon in the distance through the gauze. There was no emotion on her beautiful face. She said indifferently, It seems like it's about time. Almost simultaneously. In another divine chariot, the great divine priest of revelation stretched out his fingers and stroked the scripture in front of him. His old face revealed a peaceful and firm expression. He said, "It's almost time." A sharp and gorgeous Taoist sword had become several pieces of broken sword lying in the field. However, this sword should still be proud because it was the only flying sword that hadn't been taken away by the enemy since the beginning of the war. In the south of the field, a Taoist dressed in plain Taoist robes was looking down at his chest and abdomen. His name was Chui Rong and he was born in the Chui family of Qinghe County. He left his family when he was young and traveled around the world to cultivate. He was once worshipped by the West Hill Divine Palace and officially entered Haoyin Taoism in the Taoist Temple of the Song Kingdom. Many powerhouses of Haoyin Taoism had been hiding in the world, hiding in ordinary or even dilapidated Taoist temples. They didn't like the atmosphere of the Divine Hall and preferred to be ordinary Taoists. They would only appear in the world when Haoyin summoned them to offer their power. Taoist Chui was such an extraordinary Taoist. Taoist Chui was not famous in the cultivation world, but his state was extremely high. He had entered the knowing destiny state 10 years ago and had his own position in Haoyin Taoism where powerhouses gathered. However, he only made one move today and didn't do anything else. He looked down at his chest and abdomen quietly because his sword had been broken. There was a very deep sword wound on his chest and abdomen. It was a horrifying big bloody wound. The wet and soft intestines and other internal organs were squeezed out of the big bloody wound. It was a little slow at first, but it became faster and faster as time passed. Finally, it was like flowing water. Taoist Chui quietly watched his internal organs flowing out of his body. He didn't raise his head until the whole process was finished. He asked, "Mr. Second, swordsmanship is the most rigorous art in the world. The previous sword cut 4 inches into my body, not a bit deeper or a bit shallower. Of course, it was intentional." Second brother said, "Exactly." Taoist Chui said, "The Academy values kindness and forgiveness. Why do I have to suffer so much before I die?" Second brother calmly said, "Because I know your surname is Chui." Taoist Chui understood and said, "Mr. Second should know that I have little contact with the clan." Second brother said, "I want to use your death and pain to express the Academy's attitude." Taoist Chui asked, "What attitude?" Second brother said, "The 7 families of Qinghe County. Even if we die, we can't die happily." Taoist Chui sighed and said, "So that's how it is." After saying this, he slowly sat on the ground and began to pant. Because his lungs and trachea had been cut by the iron sword, he couldn't breathe no matter how hard he panted, so he seemed to be in great pain. After a long time, he tiredly bowed his head and finally died in pain. The sky was filled with dark clouds that blocked the sunlight, and the world was covered in darkness. Second brother was covered in blood. He stood in the wilderness, in front of hundreds of flying swords, in front of countless cultivator corpses, and looked at the cultivators in the south. He raised the iron sword in his hand again. He didn't say a word. But the cultivators in the wilderness seemed to have heard him asking who else was there. The cultivators' eyes were all attracted by the iron sword that seemed to have magic power. The iron sword was very ordinary. The body of the sword was broad and straight. It was dim and even looked a little ridiculous. But looking at the iron sword, everyone just wanted to cry. Some people wanted to cry but they couldn't. They were frightened. The cultivators, in front of the iron sword, could no longer summon up the courage to fight and finally retreated. It became quiet in front of the verdant canyon again. The blood on the ground had already accumulated into a puddle, reflecting the gloomy sky, making it look a little dark. The people of the academy rushed out from under the canopy. Wang Qi held a stool in his left hand and a medicine bag in his right hand. He rushed behind second brother and asked him to sit down. He put the medicine bag to second brother's mouth and swallowed it as fast as he could. Seventh sister was carrying a kettle and a bowl of water. Seeing that it was too late, she simply threw the bowl away and put the spout of the kettle to second brother's mouth, desperately pouring water into him. Second senior brother was not an ordinary person. He was unusual in all aspects. Even though he was surrounded by his junior brothers and sisters, he was still able to maintain his composure. He delivered the medicine with water and swallowed it in an instant. Fourth brother and sixth brother had also run over. They squatted in front of second brother and looked at a certain place on the chest of the armor with a serious expression. Taoist Chui's natal Taoist sword had pierced this place. When the Taoist sword of knowing destiny state pierced the armor, the talisman lines in the armor were automatically activated and condensed a thin and tough layer of chi of heaven and earth. Therefore the sword did not affect second brother at all. But the talisman lines hidden in the armor were shaken by Taoist Chui's sword style and slightly deformed. Sixth brother untied the box on his back and took out a set of special tools that were as exquisite as crabs. He began to repair it. Fourth brother did some calculations and diagrams beside him. Then he looked at second brother and asked, "Is there any problem with the sword?" Sixth brother looked at second brother worriedly. The iron sword was the most important piece of equipment. If it was damaged, the West Hill Divine Palace would not give them so much time, even though the Academy had brought the iron furnace and could repair it. Second brother looked at the broad and straight iron sword in his hand and said, "It can still hold for a long time." Beigong Weiyang and Shimen Buhua were still under the canopy. Their zither and flute were the best weapons against the cavalry. They had a mission on their shoulders, so they had to stay in the array. But seeing their peers helping their senior brother, they could not help but feel a little lonely and ashamed. Beigong rushed over and asked, "Do you want to listen to a song at this time?" No one answered him. Fourth brother and sixth brother were doing the final inspection of the armor. Wang Qi was checking second brother's pulse to determine his physical and mental state so that he could prepare the medicine for the next period. Seventh sister seemed to be a little more relaxed. She was wiping second brother's face with an embroidered handkerchief, but she was still busy. Beigong shouted, "Senior brother, this song is very impassioned. It is most suitable for killing." Second brother stood up and looked at the formidable enemies in the southern wilderness. He said, "Since ancient times, killing people has nothing to do with generosity or generosity. There is no need for accompaniment music. Don't be heroic, don't be generous, don't be unrestrained. You can only be cold, indifferent, and cruel. Only those who can truly do these things can kill all the enemies. Junimo is undoubtedly such a person. It seems that I still underestimated him when I commented on him last night. He is still the proudest man. I just didn't expect him to throw away all his pride or hide it in the deepest part of his armor on the battlefield." Lu Bai raised his eyebrows slightly and said, "He has been trying his best to save his energy and pursue a simpler way to kill the enemy. He is extremely stingy, calm and focused, unwilling to let go of the slightest change in the battle. He is extremely calculative. From this point of view, he is more like a stinky businessman." The disciples of the sword Garrett listened to their master's teachings in silence. They had been shocked by the man in front of the verdant canyon. Even though they were in the enemy camp, they could not help but admire him. Although their master was always the tallest figure in their hearts, they actually felt a little uncomfortable when they heard their master describe the man in such a way. But no one dared to question him. Lu Bai's voice rang out again. The disciples of the sword Garrett were shocked and speechless by the hidden meaning of this sentence. "I respect an opponent who fights with such an attitude." Lu Bai looked in the direction of the verdant canyon and said seriously, "I even regret letting him kill so many people in one day and one night. Maybe I should have done it yesterday." "Finally done. Not bad, not bad. I'm just tired. Tomorrow is Saturday. Have a good weekend." Also, I have been revising the Vermilion Bird record recently and found that, just as I always thought, the attitude in the first third is not correct. There is really something wrong with the writing. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 754. Lu Bai stood up. The disciples of the sword Garrett were stunned. They thought of what their master had said and knew that he would not wait any longer. This meant that the most powerful battle in the cultivation world was about to begin. However, at this moment, the veil of the divine chariot fluttered and Yi Hongyu walked into the field. The West Hill Divine Palace Coalition army was in low spirits. When they saw the blood-red figure in the field, they became silent and then burst into thunderous cheers. Yi Hongyu was the real genius of Haoyan Taoism. She had suppressed Prince Longqing a few years ago. She was the last opponent Ning Ke wanted to face. Chen Pippi still held the record of being the youngest person to enter the knowing destiny state. But if she wanted to, she might be able to do it before Chen Pippi. This did not sound convincing, but it turned out that she could always do something she wanted to do, such as becoming the great divine priest of judgment. Seeing Yi Hongyu appear in the field, Lu Bai put his hands behind his back and stopped moving forward. Lu Bai had never liked the bigwigs in the West Hill Divine Palace, including the Hierarch Lord. But he had always liked, or rather admired, Yi Hongyu. It was not because of him that Yi Hongyu could sit on the seat of heavenly black jade of the Divine Hall of Judgment. The paper sword in the letter was drawn by Lu Bai himself. It was also because he knew that Yi Hongyu had never been confined to the realm of that sword. She had already mastered Haoyan Taoism divine skills. Lu Bai still thought that Junimo was stronger than Yi Hongyu. But he thought that Yi Hongyu still chose to fight after Jun Mo said that she was no match for him. So she must be able to win. He wanted to know what Yi Hongyu would do. More importantly, he wanted to know the outcome of the battle between her and Jun Mo. So he chose to watch the battle again. The morale of the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition army was extremely low because of the iron sword outside the Verdant Canyon. They did not cheer up until Yi Hongyu's figure came into view. Yi Hongyu walked to the Verdant Canyon and stopped in the middle of the field. Waves of cheers came from behind her, getting louder and louder, and then suddenly stopped. Countless eyes fell on the blood-red divine robe of judgment on her. They were extremely nervous and expectant. Her appearance had such a great impact on the morale of the coalition army. The most important thing was her identity as the West Hill Great Divine Priest, even though she was the youngest Great Divine Priest of Judgment in the history of the West Hill Divine Palace. The Great Divine Priest of West Hill must be the Great Divine Priest revered by countless cultivators of Haotian Taoism. He was the god in the hearts of millions of believers of Haotian in the world. Who would think that a god would be defeated by a mortal? There were faint movements in the Divine Hall Coalition Army camp. Tens of thousands of people poured out of the camp and came to the forefront of the battlefield. They held long spears and iron spears in their hands and looked at the scene in the wilderness excitedly. The cheers and chatter had stopped. The world was silent. A knocking sound suddenly rang out. That was the sound of the end of the spear colliding with the wilderness. More and more people were hitting the ground with weapons in their hands, and the sound was getting louder and louder. Tens of thousands of spears and iron spears collided with the ground, causing it to shake. In the beginning, the sounds of countless weapons colliding with the ground were dense and messy. Then, it gradually became orderly and the rhythm became faster and faster. In the end, it became the heaviest sound. Boom. The drumming finally condensed into a thunderous roar. At the moment when the thunder roared, Yi Hongyu drew her sword. Facing such a terrible opponent like Jun Mo, she had to use her strongest sword. At the same time, her black hair that was bound by the golden divine crown was blown back by the strong wind. Her eyes suddenly brightened, and the divine starlight in the deepest part of her eyes began to burn fiercely. The purest soul could be seen dancing in the golden flame. However, the Taoist sword was still in her hand even though she had drawn her sword. The thin Taoist sword did not turn into a rainbow and fly to the Verdant Canyon, nor did it disappear in the wind. She held it in her hand and pointed it at the man in the Verdant Canyon. She did not draw her Taoist sword. But the sword had been drawn. The sky was gloomy. The wilderness in front of the Green Mountain was very dark. Suddenly, tens of thousands of white turbulence appeared between heaven and earth, piercing the Verdant Canyon. A streak of white turbulence was a sword mark. She used the divine starlight to see through the aura of heaven and earth and sent out sword marks with the Haotian divine skills. There were hundreds of sword marks on the ground of the wilderness, crossing the corpses and blood, and pointing to the Verdant Canyon. More sword marks went straight up to the sky and even into the dark clouds. Then, like feathered arrows, they fell in a perfect arc, still pointing to the Verdant Canyon. These sword scars were closer to the sky. They absorbed the heavenly light emitted from the clouds and refracted the heavenly light into rainbow-colored rays. They looked like real lightsabers. It was beautiful like a dream. Countless sword marks with a holy and solemn feeling came out from the tip of the Taoist sword in Yi Hongyu's hand. Then, some were quiet, some were swift, some were straight up to the sky, and some were still on the ground piercing Jun Mo. Seeing this incredible scene, the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army camp burst into cheers again. Liu Bai frowned slightly, a little puzzled. Jun Mo's armor was the best armor in the world. Even if it was stained with blood and dust a moment ago, it only needed to be blown by the wind for a while to become as clean as new. The bright armor was like a mirror, reflecting the scene between heaven and earth. The gloomy sky in front of the Green Mountain. The wilderness dyed red by blood. There were also hundreds of holy and solemn sword marks. With the dark sky as a curtain, those bright sword rainbows looked very beautiful. It was like a grand fireworks display. The fireworks on the armor were getting brighter and brighter, which meant that the sword marks were getting closer. Second brother looked up at the sky and did nothing. In the eyes of many, it was only a moment, but in fact he had been waiting for a long time. He had been waiting for the tens of thousands of sword marks to finally become one sword. However, that moment never came. When he was sure that the tens of thousands of sword marks would not become one sword again, he slightly raised his eyebrows. Since the beginning of the battle, there was no change of emotion on his face. This was the first time. Because he did not understand why Yi Hongyu had used so many swords. At the state that he and Yi Hongyu were in, they both knew what real power was. Beauty was not power like the fireworks on the armor. Holiness was not power like the divine light in her eyes. Magnificence was not power like the hundreds of sword marks between heaven and earth that amazed thousands of people. Concentration was power. The fireworks formed by countless swords were based on Yi Hongyu's profound West Hill divine skills. It looked grand and spectacular, but because of that, it could not be absolutely concentrated. Although the heavy rain in Chang and in summer was huge and frightening, it came and went quickly. After the rain stopped, it did not leave any marks on the ancient city wall. The dripping water in front of the eaves of the academy was quiet, but it persisted. After 1,000 years, no one knew how many hard bluestone bricks the dripped water had dripped. Second brother had never fought with Yi Hongyu. But he had seen the sword that Liu Bai had drawn for Yi Hongyu through Ning Ke, and also through Ning Ke he knew what kind of person Yi Hongyu was. In his opinion, this little girl who had just comprehended Liu Bai's sword style and dared to enter the divine hall of judgment was undoubtedly the strongest of the new generation. She was stronger than Pippi, stronger than Ning Quebec. Then it was impossible for her not to understand what real power was. Her most powerful sword strike was definitely just one sword strike. Could not be so many swords. Second brother had been waiting for Yi Hongyu's swords to become one, because he had decided to defeat her when she used her most powerful sword. That was the only way he could be happy. However, Yi Hongyu did not do so. He did not understand why she did not do so. Even if she used her most powerful sword, second brother was confident that he could defeat her. But now her sword was tens of thousands of swords, which meant that she had lost in advance. Because she could not find a chance to win. Second senior fellow apprentice suddenly understood. Yi Hongyu did not think about winning today's battle. For the final victory she could calmly give up her pride. Is this also a kind of pride? Second brother thought. Then he looked at the tens of thousands of sword marks coming to the Verdant Canyon and said, "Is this the confinement?" He raised the iron sword in his hand and slashed at the confinement divine array made up of tens of thousands of sword marks. He looked serious. It was not because of the confinement. It was because of Yi Hongyu's intention behind the confinement. The confinement was one of the most profound and powerful arrays in the West Hill Divine Palace. Ku Haoran drew a confinement array with the Haoran sword and trapped Master Lotus for decades. The former Great Divine Priest of Judgment also used the same confinement array to trap Wei Guangming in the Peach Mountain for more than 10 years. The confinement array made by Yi Hongyu with tens of thousands of sword marks was based on the Haoran sword marks she had seen at the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine. Although she had reached the peak of the knowing destiny state, she was still far from Mr. Ku and even weaker than the former Great Divine Priest of Judgment. One of the most important reasons why she could kill the former Great Divine Priest of Judgment and become the new Great Divine Priest of Judgment was that the former Great Divine Priest of Judgment had been seriously injured after Wei Guangming broke the confinement array. With her current state, the confinement array made of Taoist swords could trap countless powerhouses to death. But it was not enough to trap second brother of the academy. This meant that she would definitely lose this battle. But she was not afraid of losing. Just as second brother finally understood, she did not want to win today's battle. It was very shameful for a great divine priest of West Hill to lose in front of hundreds of thousands of believers. But she did not care. Although her confinement array could not trap second brother forever, it could at least trap him for a while. That was what she wanted. A moment was enough for the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army to do many things. For example, charging with thousands of cavalry. And when the sound of zither and flute came from the Verdant Canyon, in the sacred sedan, the great divine priest of revelation stretched out his finger and turned the West Hill scripture in front of him to a certain page. The number of chapters on Friday is wrong. These 2 days are the birthdays of my father-in-law and mother-in-law. This year is my mother-in-law's 60th birthday. It's a bit hard and I feel sleepy while writing. I'm free tomorrow. There are 2 chapters tomorrow. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 755. Etiquette is the principle. Second senior brother valued etiquette, so he was reasonable. Although he was strict and solemn, it did not hinder his understanding of the situation. Thousands of sword marks fell from the sky and surrounded him, forming a dense confinement. His gaze had already seen through the divine array and landed on Yi Hongyu's robe of judgment. He had seen through her hidden intentions. Everything was within the plan of the West Hill Divine Palace. To be more precise, it was all within Yi Hongyu's calculations. Whether it was the arrogant Jun Mo or the calm Jun Mo, they would both choose to use their swords to defeat her. Thus, she succeeded in delaying Jun Mo's attack for a moment. After a short moment, the myriad of sword lights had formed a cage, and even if Jun Mo wanted to change his move, it was already impossible. She attacked with 10,000 swords, but it was the sword of no return. She took the initiative to cater to the opponent's thoughts and opportunities, and had the ability to turn the design into reality. The process of starting the battle could be said to be perfect. She abandoned the pride and dignity of the great divine priest of Westhill and sought the first opportunity with the intention of seeking defeat. Then even second brother had to be imprisoned by thousands of sword lights for a while. The plains began to shake and thunderous hoofbeats came from outside the sword curtain. Vaguely, one could see countless armored cavalrymen charging out of the allied camp, their momentum shaking the heavens. The cavalry of the Divine Hall Coalition army surged towards the exit of the Verdant Canyon like a tide. This was the fiercest attack by the Westhill Divine Palace Coalition army since the beginning of the Battle of Verdant Canyon. Now that second brother was trapped in the confinement array, could the zither and flute in the Verdant Canyon still be as powerful as before? Under the canopy at the exit of the Verdant Canyon, Beigong Weiyang and Shimin Buhua quietly looked at the zither and flute in front of them. As they listened to the sound of hoofbeats, they slowly placed their hands on the strings or held the flutes. Beigong Weiyang's fingertips trembled slightly, and the faint sound of a zither left the string like an arrow. Shimin Buhua's body leaned forward slightly, and a dark flute sound came out of the pipe like water. At this moment, an aged voice resounded through the plains. The voice passed through the field and came to the exit of the Verdant Canyon. In the military camp in the south of the plains, the veil of the divine chariot fluttered slightly. An old voice rang out from the divine chariot. It was filled with a sacred and solemn aura that made people feel reverence. In the wilderness, preparing to depart. Anyone who wants to go will be able to go. More than 10 red-robed god officials with profound realms sat cross-legged around the divine carriage. They calmed their minds and listened to the voice coming from the divine carriage. Then they repeated their prayers. The voice didn't stop. In the divine chariot, the great divine priest of revelation looked at the scripture in front of his knees with an indifferent expression. He continued, "The seeds in the field are the food that Haotian gave to the people. The voice in the valley is the call of Haotian through the wind. March to the fallen land. Whatever Haotian told the believers, you must do it." More than 10 red-robed priests devoutly repeated the scripture. The great divine priest of revelation continued, "Those who use their voices to confuse people's minds and summon for Haotian are all sinners. Together with the remaining sinners, they will be punished by Haotian's fury." The voices of the red-robed divine officials outside the divine carriage became more and more uniform and cold. "You will suffer the punishment of Haotian's wrath." As soon as a few sounds came from the zither and a short piece of music flowed from the flute, it was interrupted by the old voice that magically appeared in the Verdant Canyon. The academy disciples were well-read. After hearing a few words, they recognized that it was the sentence of punishment in the covenant of the Westhill sect. Fourth brother's expression changed dramatically. He picked up the sand table in his hand and was ready to stir up the sand to disrupt the teaching. However, Haotian's teaching did not appear in detail. The voice of the great Westhill Divine Palace did not have a specific shape either. Nothing could interrupt the old voice except the voice itself. Beigong Weiyang's face suddenly turned pale. There was fear in his eyes. His arms trembled uncontrollably and several strings on the zither broke. Shimin Buhua's state was slightly lower, so he seemed to be in more pain. He groaned and blood flowed from his lips into the flute. Then he fell to the ground. The cavalry of the Westhill Divine Palace Coalition army, who were charging toward the Verdant Canyon, also heard the solemn teaching. They were not affected at all. Instead, they became even more fearless. The tide formed by the cavalry seemed to have encountered a hurricane. They sped up again and headed straight for the Verdant Canyon. When the teaching began to echo in the field, second brother had already confirmed that it was the great divine priest of Revelation's doing. The Battle of the Verdant Canyon had been going on for a long time. The two bigwigs of the Westhill Divine Palace had never really fought. He did not expect that the two great divine priests of Westhill would fight at the same time. Second brother's expression became more and more solemn. As powerful and proud as he was, he did not dare to say that he could face two great divine priests of Westhill alone. More importantly, the Battle of the Verdant Canyon was not a battle between powerhouses. It was an attack and defense between armies. At this moment, he was waving his iron sword and chopping at the confinement that was formed by thousands of sword lights. Every time the iron sword fell, dozens or even hundreds of sword lights would shatter and disappear. If he was given more time, he could easily break the confinement and defeat Yi Hongyu. However, the cavalry had already arrived. The sound of the zither and flute had stopped. If he still focused on the confinement, his junior brothers and sisters in the Verdant Canyon would definitely be crushed by the cavalry. He could not allow that to happen. He could not afford to waste any more time in the confinement array. He had to break the array as soon as possible. However, no matter how powerful he was, how could he break the confinement in an instant? No matter how powerful the iron sword in his hand was, how could it instantly break the sword curtain formed by thousands of sword lights? So he withdrew his iron sword. He no longer tried to use the iron sword to break the confinement. He looked at Yi Hongyu outside the sword curtain and remained silent. He withdrew all of his aura into his body. At this moment, he was no longer the arrogant Jun Mo with the unparalleled sword style. He was just an ordinary person. Yi Hongyu immediately realized what he was going to do. Her expression suddenly froze. The confinement that fell from the sky was formed by tens of thousands of sword lights. It was a marvelous and powerful array. However, the sword lights still carried their own sword style. When second brother withdrew all his aura and lowered the iron sword in his hand, no longer contending against the confinement formation, the sword curtain formed by tens of thousands of sword lights suddenly collapsed toward the center and pierced his body. He wanted to use his own body to resist the tens of thousands of sword lights. Only in this way could he escape from the confinement in the shortest time possible. However, even powerhouses of the Devil's Doctrine like Tang or Xiaohe would end up in a miserable state if they tried to resist Yi Hongyu's thousands of sword lights with their bodies. Second brother's body was just that of an ordinary person. How could he resist it? With the collapse of the confinement and the arrival of tens of thousands of sword lights, the magnificent fireworks on the shiny armor suddenly became denser and brighter, as if it would be ignited in the next moment. In a very short time, the armor on second brother's body released countless talisman intents, which collided with the countless sword lights coming from the sky and stirred up countless terrifying turbulences of the chi of heaven and earth. Bang, 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 bang. The tens of thousands of sword lights fell on the surface of the armor, making extremely dense sounds of friction and cutting. Occasionally there was a slight roar like a tiny thunder and lightning. It was extremely terrifying. The ground under second brother's feet suddenly sank, and more than 10 pieces of gravel were torn into powder. As for the grass that was stained with blood, it had already turned into flying ash and disappeared. The armor that covered his whole body shot out countless blazing rays of light. His whole body seemed to be burning, and no one could see clearly what was going on in the flames. The next moment, the wide and straight iron sword reappeared in everyone's sight. The iron sword cut through the countless sword lights and the friction flames on the surface of the armor, cut through the chilling air in the wilderness, cut through the whistling wind, and fell on Yi Hongyu's face. As the iron sword waved out, second brother's figure also appeared from the flames. He did not move forward. Instead, he took a step back. Since the beginning of the battle, no matter how many enemies he faced, he had never taken a step back. Now he finally took a step back. He did not take a step back because there was no way out. He took a step back because the younger brothers and sisters at the exit of the Verdant Canyon behind him needed his protection. The cavalry of the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army had already arrived in front of him. Second brother looked up, raised his sword, and began to kill again. There was still no extra emotion on his face. His movements were as meticulous as ever, without the slightest deviation. However, the armor had already become charred black and tattered. The divine robe of judgment danced in the wilderness and formed a blood lotus in front of him. The sword style that came from afar, with the unique chilling intent of the iron sword, destroyed the blood lotus and then disappeared. Yi Hongyu's face was slightly pale, and blood seeped from the corner of her mouth. The confinement array that she had made with thousands of sword lights had been broken by Jun Mo in such a way. This was something she had not expected. But there was no shock or disappointment on her face. Instead, there was a calm smile on her face. She stopped watching the battle at the Verdant Canyon and turned to walk to her divine chariot. She had achieved her goal. The main force of the academy defending the Verdant Canyon was, of course, Jun Mo. But the most troublesome thing for the cavalry was the sound of the zither and the flute. Today's plan of the West Hill Divine Palace was for her to fight Jun Mo, and then the cavalry to lure out the sound of the zither and the flute. Finally, the great divine priest of revelation would lead the priests in red to break the sound. The whole plan had been executed perfectly. Although Jun Mo had broken out of the confinement array earlier than she had expected, she did not care. Because the zither strings were broken, the flute was bleeding, and the two disciples of the academy were no longer able to fight. And she believed that although Junimo looked fine, he must have been seriously injured. Because it was her sword. Her confinement. No matter how powerful Junimo was, he must have paid a great price to break out of the array in such an unexpected way. Yi Hongyu was very confident about this. She was most confident about fighting. Golden keyboard. We should have gotten first place in the annual novel contest. This is really... You guys are too good to me. Thank you. Although it's just like the past 2 years, I feel that I can accept it, but I'm still a little ashamed. I'll write more books in the future. It's still the same old saying. Recently, I haven't been updating regularly. This is my problem. It'll be better from today onwards. I think it'll be very, very good until the end of the month. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 756. The result of the battle in the Verdant Canyon had been decided. The zither and the flute were gone, and no one could stop the charge of thousands of iron soldiers. Junimo could not do it even if he was not injured. Even if Liu Bai suddenly changed sides, he could not do it. The academy could only retreat to the Verdant Canyon for a while. The West Hill Divine Palace had already prepared a plan for them. Yi Hongyu no longer paid attention to the situation in the Verdant Canyon. She turned around and walked towards the sacred sedan. Although she was injured, she looked calm and steady. In terms of state and strength, there was still a gap between her and Junimo. However, she was good at fighting. Most importantly, she was very calm and did not limit the battle to just 2 people because of pride. This was a battle between the West Hill Divine Palace and the Academy. She was not fighting alone. Therefore, this battle would end with the West Hill Divine Palace's victory. Countless iron cavalries arrived. Smoke and dust rose and the Verdant Canyon was restless. Second brother stood in front of the Verdant Canyon. The iron sword had already left his hand and turned into a dark sword radiance. It swept back and forth in the field within a radius of 1,000 feet in front of him. The iron sword was heavy and square-shaped, but its flying speed was surprisingly fast. The seemingly blunt and edgeless sword body tore the armor of the cavalrymen apart like tearing paper, causing blood to spurt out of them. Even if the sword only brushed past the enemies, the cavalry's chests collapsed and their bones were broken as if they were hit by a small mountain. The horses that were hit by the iron sword kept falling over. From time to time, the sound of heavy objects falling to the ground could be heard in front of the Verdant Canyon. The smoke and dust grew thicker and the people groaned. Countless cavalries fell off their horses and died. However, human power was limited. Second brother's speed and angle did not show any signs of slowing down. However, everyone knew that the psyche power in his sense of perception was being consumed at an extremely fast speed. If he allowed this situation to continue, no matter how vigorous his psyche power was, there would come a time when it would be exhausted. What was even more chilling was that the cavalrymen of the Divine Hall were not afraid of the iron sword at all. No one knew whether it was because they saw the prospect of victory or because they were inspired by the teaching of the great divine priest of revelation, but they kept charging fearlessly. The number of cavalrymen rushing to the Verdant Canyon was increasing faster than Second Brother's killing speed. Several cavalrymen successfully broke through the iron sword, brushed past Second Brother's body, and rushed toward the Verdant Canyon. Second Brother waved his right hand but did not recall the iron sword. Instead, he directly controlled the iron sword to slash across the field outside the Verdant Canyon. More than 10 cavalrymen were neatly cut in half like straws. Then he glanced at the cavalrymen. A long time ago, Ning Ke had asked Master Yen Sei what kind of state Second Brother's knowing destiny state was. Master Yen Sei thought for a while and said, "As long as he looks at you, you will die." Second Senior Brother glanced at the cavalrymen. The psyche power in his sense of perception broke through the air and entered the minds of the cavalrymen accurately and wantonly. Although the cavalrymen were not cultivators, they had brains, so they died. However, this was just a scene on the battlefield, just a corner of the raging ocean. It could not affect the overall situation. When countless cavalrymen charged forward without any regard for their own lives, everything would be crushed. Su Shi and Qin Pipi both said that there was no cultivator in the world who could stop the cavalry charge, unless he had surpassed the 5 states and become an extraordinary being. Su Shi used to be the top military man of the Tang Empire, so he knew the power of the cavalry the best. Qin Pipi was a young genius of Haoyan Taoism and had studied in the academy for many years, so he knew the rules of the cultivation world the best. Therefore, the conclusion made by these 2 people could stand the test. Second Brother was very strong. He had reached the peak of the 5 states and stood at the knowing destiny state for many years. Even when facing the Sage of Sword Liu Bai, he had to challenge his confidence. However, he had not crossed the threshold after all. In front of thousands of cavalrymen, he waved the iron sword. His armor was scorched and tattered, and his face gradually turned pale. He looked like a black reef in the raging waves, and no one knew when it would collapse. No one knew whether the headmaster had done it intentionally or not. Anyway, the disciples of the second floor of the academy had been at the peak of their respective fields for many years. When they were together, they were the most perfect and powerful combination. The combination of the second floor of the academy could fight against powerhouses like the Abbey Dean of the Jisho Abbey or the chief monk of scripture with a slight change. They could also stop hundreds of thousands of troops from advancing, just like in the Verdant Canyon. It was a pity that the whole world was fighting against the Tang Empire. The academy, which could defeat any enemy once united, had to be exhausted and was forced to split into several groups. Several people were fighting against the West Hill Divine Palace hierarch at the back of the mountain of the academy. Eldest brother was fighting against the most powerful opponent of the academy. Although the disciples who appeared in front of the Verdant Canyon were equally powerful, they were not perfect. There were loopholes, and this loophole was captured by Yi Hongyu today. In the specific situation of the Verdant Canyon, Beigong Weiyang and Shimen Buhua played the key roles. Although their states were ordinary, they played a very important role. Because in the world, only the two of them could enter the Tao through rhythms. So they were loopholes. Because they were irreplaceable. So Yi Hongyu could use her own failure or even death to gamble on them. Beigong Weiyang and Shimen Buhua sat under the canopy. Their faces were pale and there was blood in front of them. Beigong's face was full of unwillingness and pain. He stretched out his trembling fingers trying to tie the strings on the zither again, but he could not exert any strength. There was only one string left. Even if he could play it, how could he make a song? Wang Qi took 2 handfuls of pills and nervously stuffed them into his senior brother's mouths. He said in a trembling voice, "I'm fine." Sixth brother held an iron hammer and stood in front of the canopy. He silently looked at the battlefield not far away. He looked at the cavalry that had broken through the iron sword and was charging towards them. He slowly clenched his fists. Muyu looked at second brother's figure, which was faintly discernible. It seemed that he would disappear in the next moment. Her beautiful face was full of nervousness and worry. Her fingers that were holding the red string trembled slightly. If the cavalry rushed over, the tactical array she controlled would be the last resort of the academy disciples. But she knew that there were too many cavalry and their impact was too strong. The tactical array alone could not stop them. Fourth brother had participated in the design of the tactical array, so he knew this very well. So he did not look at the battlefield or the red string in Muyu's hand. Instead, he kept calculating on the sand table, frowning. Just as Yi Hongyu had planned, he found that he could not figure out any way to solve the current crisis. Because the strings of the zither were broken and the flute was bleeding. There was no one else in the world who could make the zither and flute play. At the bottom of the pit of despair there was always hope. For example, at the bottom of a dry well, there would sometimes be clear water seeping out, and sometimes there would be a big reversal. Just when the cavalry was about to reach the Verdant Canyon. Just when everyone thought that the zither and flute would never play again. A zither played in the Verdant Canyon. The sound of the zither was crisp and gentle. But when it entered everyone's ears, it was a soul-stirring story. The autumn wind blew. A scholar came to the Verdant Canyon. A cotton jacket covered with dust. A pair of straw sandals, thousands of mountains and rivers. The ladle broke into pieces after defeating Master Chi Mei, who had become a Buddha through his physical body. There was only a wooden stick at his waist. He walked to Beigong and picked up the zither. He held it in his arms and played it with his right hand. There was only one string left on the zither. His fingers fell on the string. The zither trembled slightly and made a buzzing sound. Then his fingers fell again and the string moved again. It was just one string. Instead he played a song. The song was peaceful and elegant. In the southern wilderness. The zither played in the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army. The song was like a high mountain like flowing water. Who would have thought that it was just played by a string? Around the divine chariot, more than 10 red-robed priests were frightened by the sound of the zither. Their singing suddenly stopped. The magnificent divine chariot suddenly looked extremely shabby in the elegant song. Deep in the veil of the divine chariot, the wrinkles on the face of the great divine priest of revelation deepened at a speed visible to the naked eye. With a cracking sound, the bottom of the divine chariot broke and fell heavily to the ground. In front of the Verdant Canyon. Countless cavalrymen landed heavily on the ground, accompanied by rumbling noises. The peaceful and elegant music had no killing intent, but it killed countless people in an instant. There was dead silence in the wilderness. Only the sound of the zither echoed. Everyone in the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition army was shocked speechless. Yi Hongyu, who was still in the wilderness, suddenly turned around and looked at the verdant canyon with a look of disbelief. The great divine priest of revelation, who looked older than before, looked at the verdant canyon and murmured, "Why is he here? Where is the Abbey Dean?" Beside the quiet carriage. Lu Bai looked at the verdant canyon and said with emotion, "You are lucky to see Mr. First in action. What shocked me most was that he had learned to kill." The sound of the zither was faint and faded away. Until then, there were countless screams in the wilderness in front of the verdant canyon. No one knew how many cavalries and injured warhorses were entangled together, struggling desperately. Eldest brother looked at this tragic scene and was silent. Yi Hongyu did not make a mistake. Beigong Weiyang and Shimen Buhua were indeed the loopholes in the verdant canyon. No one in the world could replace the two of them who had entered the way of temperament. But she did not know one thing. The disciples of the academy were not cultivating on their own in the back of the mountain. Although they were already the strongest in their respective fields before they were accepted as core disciples by the headmaster of the academy, they were willing to study in the academy. It meant that they were sure that they could learn better knowledge in the academy. It meant that there was someone in the academy who could teach them. This also meant that that person was stronger than all of them in their strongest areas. That person was not the headmaster of the academy. Although the headmaster of the academy knew a lot, he was a lazy and irresponsible teacher. Other than teaching the eldest and second brothers, the headmaster of the academy had been herding sheep since the third brother, Yu Lian. As for the core disciples, he basically did not care. Someone else was responsible for teaching these disciples. That person was Li Manman. He was the eldest brother of the academy. All these years, he had been teaching in the back of the mountain on behalf of the master. Except for talisman Taoism and fighting, he knew everything that the disciples could do. Whether it was zither, chess, calligraphy, painting or cooking. And he was very strong. All kinds of strongest. The strongest in the world. Good night, everyone. See you tomorrow. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 757. Eldest brother put down the zither and clapped his hands, sending 2 streams of aura into Beigong and Shimen's bodies. Then he lowered his head and began to repair the zither and the flute. Jun Imo, covered in blood, walked back from the field and bowed to eldest brother. Everyone from the academy came back to their senses and bowed to eldest brother. Eldest brother returned the bow and said, "Thank you." Everyone noticed the blood on eldest brother's cotton gown and knew that the battle between him and the Abbey Dean was more dangerous and difficult than the Battle of Verdant Canyon, so they were very worried. Eldest brother did not want them to worry, so he looked up at the canopy and said, "This seems to be used by the back mountain to block the sun. You actually used it to block arrows. It's not bad, but you have to be careful of the flying swords." Then he rearranged the tactical array and arrangement in front of the Verdant Canyon. The autumn wind blew again. His cotton-padded robe was sliced open by the Taoist sword. Cotton peeked out from the cracks and trembled slightly in the wind. Then it turned into shadows. Eldest brother's figure disappeared under the canopy. In the field in front of the Green Mountain, Yi Hongyu summoned her Taoist sword to protect her Taoist heart. Her face was full of solemnity. She did not know if the figure would appear in front of her in the next moment. In the south of the field, in the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army camp, the disciples of the Sword Garrett looked around as if they were facing a formidable enemy. Lu Bai sat quietly beside the ashes from last night. He looked calm and the sword on his knees was in its sheath. No one knew where Mr. First of the Academy had gone, but everyone could guess that he would definitely come here. The next moment, eldest brother's figure appeared in the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army in the south of the field. He looked at the old great divine priest of revelation in the depths of the divine chariot through layers of gauze and pulled out the short wooden stick from his waist. The great divine priest of revelation looked at the scholar outside the gauze, and the wrinkles on his face deepened. More than a dozen red-robed priests shouted and rushed to the divine chariot. Eldest brother held the short wooden stick and looked at the great divine priest of revelation outside the gauze, but did not do anything. Those red-clothed divine adjudicators were sent flying like stones and fell heavily onto the ground, sending up mud and dust. They were all unconscious, and on each of their foreheads was a clear red and swollen mark. The starlight in the depths of the great divine priest of Revelation's eyes suddenly burned. Wherever he looked, layers of gauze also burned, as if they had become the divine fire of Hao Yin's divine kingdom, blocking in front of the eldest brother. The eldest senior brother raised the wooden stick in his hand. His cotton-padded jacket trembled slightly, leaving behind an afterimage. He still seemed to be quietly standing outside the divine chariot, standing outside the layers of burning gauze. At the end of the shadow there was another Xinlian. He had crossed the horrible divine fire and came to the front of the great divine priest of Revelation. The great divine priest of Revelation looked at him and said expressionlessly, "Those who believe in Hao Yin," eldest brother said, "Z does not speak." The great divine priest of Revelation stopped talking. Eldest senior brother raised his cudgel and struck. Looking at the wooden stick breaking through the air, the great divine priest of Revelation saw 4,892 possibilities in a moment. The scripture in front of him shone with boundless light. He hid his true form in the light. He did not hesitate to damage his Taoist heart to see the future, so he avoided the 4,892 possibilities. The eldest senior brother stood in front of him, holding the wooden stick and striking down simply. This strike seemed simple, but it was actually very complicated. In this short period of time, the short stick had been swung 4,893 times. In the end it was still a blow on the head. There was a dull sound of collision in the divine chariot. Countless turbulence of the aura of heaven and earth sprayed around like a hurricane. Those curtains that had been ignited by the divine fire instantly turned into countless charred butterflies, flying all over the field. The scripture, which was shining with boundless light, turned into dust in the autumn wind. The body of the great divine priest of Revelation reappeared in the divine chariot, sitting cross-legged and covered with blood. The eldest senior brother's strike had hit the great divine priest of Revelation's forehead, and also hit his Taoist heart. Just a blow on the head had caused the great divine priest of Revelation to suffer irreparable injuries. The blood that wasn't thick, even a bit chilly, continuously flowed along the wrinkles on his face. It was as if a torrential rain suddenly descended on a dried-up mountain stream. But he looked very calm because he knew his ending from the moment he heard the sound of the zither. When the Buddhism and Taoism sects ambushed Ning Kai and Sang Sang in the White Tower Temple of the Yueluan Kingdom, they were about to succeed. But in the end, because of the sound of the zither, an irreversible change occurred. There were indeed not many new things in the world. Mr. First is indeed Mr. First. The Academy set up the ambush in the Verdant Canyon, so they had already set the coordinates. The Divine Hall did not think of this, so it is natural that they failed. The great divine priest of Revelation looked at the eldest senior brother and said. The eldest senior brother knew why the great divine priest wanted to talk to him at this time, but he felt it was rude not to answer, so he replied, "So the Abbey Dean will arrive later than me. I want to hurry up and do something." The quiet carriage was not far from the divine chariot. When the divine chariot turned into a burning train and then into the bleak autumn leaves, the coalition army of the divine hall exclaimed in shock and horror. The disciples of the sword Garrett turned pale. The expression on Liu Bai's face finally changed. He was no longer as calm as before. The sword was still on his knees, but just like his mood, it seemed to feel some kind of threat and became excited and vigilant. The sword buzzed slightly and half of the sword was out of the scabbard. 2 years ago in the autumn, he had met Mr. First in the sword Garrett. At that time he sat by the pond and Mr. First stood in front of him. Mr. First could move tens of thousands of miles and so could his sword. So even though he called back the flying sword, he was very calm. Because he was sure that no matter how high Mr. First's state was, he could not threaten him. Today, on the field in front of Green Mountain, he saw the figure of the scholar again and was a little surprised by his progress. But when the divine chariot turned into ruins, he was sure that gentle guy had really learned to fight. A person who knew everything except fighting and could be the strongest in the world. Now that he had even learned to fight, could he also be the strongest in this aspect? Who could be a match for him? Liu Bai slowly reached out and held the slightly vibrating hilt with a happy expression on his face. It was really a good thing to have such an opponent in the world. However, what made him feel a little disappointed was that this battle did not happen. Eldest brother left. He played a murderous song with a string and injured a great divine priest of West Hill with a wooden stick. Then he left quietly. He came in a hurry and left in a hurry. The reason for this? It was because a Taoist appeared on the field in front of the Verdant Canyon. The Taoist was dressed in green. Today's writing was a little hard. There is no need to name the chapter. This is more suitable. There is another chapter. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 758. In the past 2 days on the island, at the foot of Wa Mountain, in the town, in the city, in the green gauze tent and many other places in the world, there were always two figures appearing one after another. The former wore a cotton-padded jacket, and the latter wore a cyan Taoist robe. This was a battle above the 5 states, a chase between distanceless states. Both of them were distanceless, but there was still a difference in their states. The eldest brother had bought some time in front of the Verdant Canyon today because the academy had prepared in advance. But he knew that this time would be extremely short, so he left in a hurry. The moment his figure disappeared, the Taoist in indigo arrived in front of the Verdant Canyon. Countless pairs of eyes fell on the Taoist in indigo in the wilderness. This was the first time the Abbey Dean of the Jishou Abbey appeared in front of the world. Yi Hongyu knelt down to the back of the Taoist in indigo in the distance and bowed her head respectfully. The sound of armor rubbing against each other sounded like waves of wheat. Many people knelt down. The disciples of the academy in front of the Verdant Canyon did not kneel or bow. They silently looked at the powerhouse of Haotian Taoism, slightly pale but firm. The second brother looked at the Taoist in indigo, walked out of the tent and raised the iron sword in his hand. The Taoist in indigo glanced at him without any expression on his face. Then he turned to the southern wilderness and looked at the burning divine chariot. He frowned slightly and felt the subtle changes in the aura of heaven and earth. His Taoist heart suddenly showed signs of restlessness. It was not because the divine chariot was destroyed, nor was it because the great divine priest of revelation was seriously injured. For the secluded Jishou Abbey, only the belief of Haotian was really important. Even if the West Hill Divine Palace was destroyed, it was not a big deal. What made the Taoist in indigo uneasy was where the eldest brother's next journey would end. With his Taoist heart slightly disturbed, the Taoist in indigo knew that he had to leave immediately. This meant that the academy had calculated the time difference very clearly and did not give him any time to take action. This was the goal that the academy had to achieve. The eldest brother appeared in front of the Verdant Canyon and immediately turned the tide, destroying the most important combat power of the West Hill Divine Palace. If the Taoist in indigo had time to take action, how many disciples of the academy in front of the Verdant Canyon would have survived? This time difference was calculated by the eldest brother and the fourth brother after several nights of calculation. They believed that there should be no problem. However, they still underestimated the Taoist in indigo's strength. The strongest cultivator of the Taoist sect, the lonely man under Hao Tian, his realm was unfathomable and unfathomable. In the prior plan, the academy was sure that the Taoist in indigo had to chase after the eldest brother and leave without any time to attack. However, they did not expect that the Taoist in indigo could attack at the same time. The Taoist in indigo turned around and walked toward the southern wilderness. He casually waved his right hand behind him. As his footsteps landed on the soft soil, the harsh autumn air suddenly became cold. The autumn wind in front of him suddenly froze into a thin layer of snow and rustled down. A door vaguely appeared in the middle of it. It was a passage hidden in the turbulence of the aura of heaven and earth. It was a path that only those in the limitless realm could see. The Taoist in green's right foot stepped into the door and immediately turned into nothingness. In the eyes of countless people in front of the Verdant Canyon, he seemed to have broken through the void. Hundreds of thousands of people from the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army saw this miraculous scene and were shocked speechless. At this moment, a sword appeared in his right hand, which he had casually waved backwards. A sword condensed from air. The sword had already left his hand and pierced the thatched roof in front of the Verdant Canyon, which was covered with broken arrows. After the Taoist in indigo appeared, the Verdant Canyon became very quiet. The quietest person was second brother. He silently lowered his head and looked at the stone a foot and a half in front of him. He did not look at the Taoist in indigo because he wanted to maintain his full fighting spirit and confidence. He also did not look at the iron sword in his hand because a sword was not meant to be looked at. After the Taoist in indigo threw out the flying sword, second brother moved. He suddenly looked up and stared at the flying sword condensed from air. The iron sword in his hand trembled slightly. Could this iron sword, which had killed thousands of soldiers and horses, block this seemingly simple virtual sword? No one knew the answer. Because the virtual sword displayed by the Taoist in indigo suddenly became real nothingness in front of Junimo. It quietly passed through the area where he was and returned to reality behind him, continuing to stab under the awning. This method seemed to make the Taoist sword enter the limitless state. It was really incredible. In the face of such an unfathomable flying sword, second brother did not show any shock or fear on his face. Instead, he slightly frowned and looked down on the opponent. This virtual sword was indeed clever and the choice was indeed accurate. Since it was a sloppy sword before leaving, of course the Taoist in indigo had to ensure that his sword could create the greatest lethality. Because this sword was a little sloppy, the Taoist in indigo let second brother go. In a sense, this was a respect for second brother. But in second brother's view, this was ridiculous. With the identity and state of the Taoist in indigo, he actually had to think about dealing with the disciples of the academy. It was really vulgar. So he looked down on this person. Even if his state was far above mine, even if he was the Abbey Dean of the Jisho Abbey, even if he was the highest peak in the cultivation world after the teacher ascended to heaven, he still looked down on him. No matter how powerful a person was, as long as he had a vulgar aura, second brother would not take him seriously. Of course, this did not mean more. Second brother knew how terrifying the power of the virtual sword was. He slightly raised his sword-like eyebrows. He looked down on the Taoist in indigo because he did not see through the tactical array in the iron shelter. Although the virtual sword had let him go, once it entered the shelter, he would be the one to bear the sword style. Because there was a red thread tied under his feet. The other end of the red thread was under the shelter, connected to all the junior brothers and sisters. He was ready to bear the virtual sword. He was ready to be injured. Seriously injured. But he was not ready to die. Because if he died, the verdant canyon would not be able to be defended. The broken arrows on the iron shelter were disturbed by the chi of heaven and earth carried by the virtual sword. They flowed down from the eaves like falling sand, like a waterfall of arrows. Inside the waterfall, seventh sister Muyu was pale. She held the red thread tightly in her hand and pulled it hard. Looking at the back of the man outside the shelter, her fingers trembled violently. Second brother would bear all the physical attacks that she, her fellow disciples, and the iron shelter suffered. However, this time the opponent was not a disciple of the sword Garrett of the South Jin Kingdom, but the godlike Abbey Dean of the Jisho Abbey. Could senior brother bear it? How badly would he be injured? Would he be okay? Suddenly she saw a shocking scene from the corner of her eyes. The red line buried in the sand had been quietly cut off by someone. Fourth brother's fingers had just left his ankle. There was another red thread tied to his ankle. The red thread was originally connected to second brother, but now it was tied to his ankle. This meant that he would be the one to bear the virtual sword of the Taoist in indigo. This tactical array was originally designed by fourth brother and herself, and finally modified by eldest brother. Muyu knew that there would be no problem with fourth brother's changes at this time. However, fourth brother was only at the see-through realm. How could he withstand a blow from the Abbey Dean? Before Muyu could scream, the virtual sword had arrived. The faint shadow of the sword seemed to have gone beyond the scope of speed. When it entered the iron shelter in front of the verdant canyon, its speed suddenly slowed down and became visible to the naked eye. The tactical array under the iron shelter was activated, and the red thread tied to the feet of all the academy disciples began to shake violently. Countless fine and tough auras were produced. The virtual sword was bound by countless auras and suddenly slowed down. It was like the sly sword of Lu Yiqing, a knowing destiny state powerhouse from the sword Garrett. However, the gap between the Abbey Dean of the Jisho Abbey and Lu Yiqing was like heaven and earth. This seemingly random virtual sword was tens of thousands of times stronger than Lu Yiqing's sly sword. There was a tearing sound. That illusory sword broke through all the threads of aura like it was breaking dry weeds and rotten wood. Then, it pierced deeply into the yellow sand. The yellow sand was very fine. It was whiter than the fine sand by the sea and finer than the gravel by the river. It was extremely soft. Although there was sand in the field before the verdant canyon, it was absolutely impossible to find this kind of yellow sand. This kind of yellow sand could only be found in one place. In the sand table where fourth brother was always with him. The virtual sword pierced into the sand table. Fourth brother's face suddenly turned pale. He held the sand table high in front of him, and his hands trembled violently. This seemingly inconspicuous sand table had actually blocked the virtual sword of the Taoist in indigo. The virtual sword disappeared in the sand table and into the yellow sand. The yellow sand danced and there were several big rivers. The yellow sand gradually fell and there were steep mountains and rivers. Each sand was a world and there was a world in the sand table. It was a very magnificent river and mountain. The illusory sword danced in the seemingly boundless rivers and mountains. Because of its magnificence and grandeur, it was difficult for the virtual sword to touch anything. Therefore, the horrible power of the virtual sword could not be released. The sword flew in the sand table over the mountains and rivers and the fields and sky. The sword flew very lonely. The figure of the Taoist in indigo was about to disappear in the void. He was about to go from the verdant canyon to the next place. He did not care about the outcome of the virtual sword, because he was very sure that even if Junimo took that sword, he would inevitably be seriously injured. The disciples of the academy could no longer guard the verdant canyon. At this moment he suddenly let out a soft sound. This sound showed that he was a little surprised. The thin snow gradually fell, and the passage of the aura of heaven and earth was closed. The Taoist in indigo disappeared from the field. The words he said before he left were still echoing in the air. It's the river and mountain sandbox. The river and mountain sandbox was something in the ancient legend of the diviner Taoism. In the Kaiyuan period of the Tang dynasty, the river and mountain sandbox was lost without a trace, and the river and mountain sandbox deduction algorithm was also lost. Not many people knew that less than 40 years later, Ing Shanren, the seventh founder of the Black Ink Garden in the Great River Kingdom, and Elder Don Win Nun, a famous mathematics professor of the academy, worked together for 6 years and recreated the river and mountain sandbox. Later, the two sages spent their whole lives recasting the river and mountain sandbox. After that, the river and mountain sandbox had been left in the back of the mountain of the academy. As time went by, it was gradually forgotten by the whole cultivation world. Even the master of calligraphy of the Black Ink Garden did not know this secret. Many years ago, when the headmaster traveled around the countries to find the exit of the underworld or to look for delicious food, he met a young apprentice in a pawn shop outside the wetland of Yinluan town. The headmaster watched the young apprentice for a long time because he felt that the young apprentice's abacus was very beautiful and the sound of it was very pleasant. The young apprentice was called Fan Yu, and later became the fourth pro-disciple of the headmaster. The headmaster naturally gave him the river and mountain sandbox. Now, except for the people in the back of the mountain of the academy, only Mo Shanshan knew about it. The Taoist in indigo left. His virtual sword was still there. It was still flying in the river and mountain sandbox. The fourth brother held the sandbox and his face became paler and paler. Blood gradually flowed from his lips. The second brother returned to the tent. Muyu looked at him and asked in a trembling voice, "What should we do?" The second brother was silent for a long time and said, "I don't know." The sixth brother said, "I'll smash the sandbox with a hammer." The fourth brother used all his psyche power, especially his spirit connected with the river and mountain sandbox to trap the virtual sword. He was too weak to speak, but he was furious when he heard the second brother's words. "You can smash me to death first." He stared at the sixth brother angrily and kept coughing up blood as he spoke. The sixth brother put down the iron hammer helplessly. Wang Qi looked at the fourth brother who was holding the sandbox and said worriedly, "Do you always hold it like this?" "Senior brother, if you are tired I can do it for you. I have brewed the medicine for 2 days." The fourth brother listened to the younger brother's naive words and said with relief, "No, I can't let it go." As soon as he said this, there was a dead silence under the iron tent. He had lost so much blood in such a short time. How long could the fourth brother hold it? Even if he could hold it, could he hold it forever? The second brother looked at him and asked, "Will the sword stop by itself?" The fourth brother shook his head and said, "The river and mountain sandbox is a virtual realm, and the sword is a virtual sword. There is no air or external influence. Even if it stops, it will be hundreds of years later." The second brother asked again, "What will happen if I let it go?" The fourth brother was silent for a moment and said, "It will explode." The second brother said, "Then let it explode." The fourth brother shook his head and said with a painful smile, "I don't want the sixth brother to smash it, not because I don't want to let it go. Although it has been with me for so many years, it will explode as soon as I let it go. So even if you want it to explode, you have to let me go far away." Everyone was silent. "Of course I know you don't want me to go far away and die alone." The fourth brother looked at them and said with a smile, "So I will hold it as long as possible." The second brother turned to look at the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition army in the south and said, "Don't worry, there is another way." "What is it? Tell us, senior brother." Muyu asked anxiously. "If the eldest brother can get rid of the Abidine, he can solve this problem for you. What if he can't? Besides, the eldest brother doesn't know what happened here." "Then we can kill the Abidine. As long as he is dead or seriously injured, his sword will become a piece of scrap metal. The headmaster is gone. Who can kill the Abidine now? To end this war we have to kill him." So it's not a matter of who can kill him. Whether it is the Battle of Verdant Canyon or anything else, they are all preparations to kill him. The second brother said, Chang and has been waiting for him. I'm really tired today. I don't know why I'm tired. See you tomorrow. 2 chapters. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 759. There was a simple Taoist abbey in the deep forest. Behind the Taoist abbey was a bright lake. There were 7 thatched cottages by the lake, their roofs covered with golden and jade-like straws. A green robe suddenly appeared on the lake. The abbey dean appeared by the lake. There was a half-collapsed thatched cottage by the lake. Golden straws were everywhere, and a dark red book, ink, paper, and inkstone could be faintly seen under it. Seeing this, the abbey dean's face turned cold. A middle-aged Taoist stood under a blue stone by the lake with a horsetail whisk on his arm. His face was pale and solemn. He only relaxed a little when he saw the abbey dean. He said tiredly, "Greetings, senior brother." The abbey dean ignored him and looked at the half-collapsed thatched cottage in silence. There was a rustling sound. Eldest brother crawled out from under the grass. His hair and cotton-padded jacket were stuck with grass. There was blood at the corner of his mouth. He looked a little embarrassed. He must have been injured when fighting with the middle-aged Taoist. Few people in the cultivation world knew about the existence of the middle-aged Taoist. But it did not mean that he was not powerful. Many years ago, the headmaster used a wooden stick to force him to stay away from the land. He only dared to drift in the South Sea. From that day on, everything in the Jisho Abbey was handled by the middle-aged Taoist. The middle-aged Taoist was the second most powerful person in the Jisho Abbey. He lived in seclusion, but once he made a move, it would be earth-shattering. That was why eldest brother was injured. The abbey dean looked at eldest brother in the thatched cottage and said, "You knew that younger brother was guarding the Taoist abbey. But you came here deliberately. I think it is not wise." Eldest brother replied, "Since the abbey dean has chased me all the way here, it means that my choice is correct." The abbey dean suddenly asked, "Have you been to the Jisho Abbey?" Eldest brother shook his head calmly. The abbey dean frowned slightly and asked, "Then how did you mark the location of the Jisho Abbey in your sense of perception?" The headmaster knew the location of the Jisho Abbey. Eldest brother raised his right hand and pointed at his forehead with his index finger. He said with a smile, "Then he told me." The abbey dean said, "You have been traveling around the world for the past 2 days, but never came here. You must have been waiting for that moment." Eldest brother said, "That's right. Because that is the only way I could buy some time in the Verdant Canyon. Abbey dean, you have to leave with me immediately." The abbey dean said, "I left a sword at the Verdant Canyon." After a moment of silence, the eldest brother said, "I trust them." The abbey dean asked, "Why are you so sure that I will leave the Verdant Canyon with you?" "Because I came to the Jisho Abbey. You have to follow me to the Jisho Abbey. You can't be any slower." The eldest brother said calmly, "Before that, my junior brothers and I had been thinking about what could be more important to you than destroying the Tang Empire and the Academy. We thought about it for a long time, but we couldn't think of a suitable answer." The abbey dean and the middle-aged priest were silent. Eldest brother looked at the ink-red ancient book buried in the straw in front of him and said with a smile, "Later we finally realized that, for you, your faith in Haoyin, or rather, your reverence for it, is greater than countless in the human world. The Tomes of Arcane is a sacred object given by Haoyin to Haoyin Taoism. 2 volumes have been lost for thousands of years. Haoyin will naturally be unhappy. If I take away the remaining 5 volumes, it will be interesting whether I destroy them or hide them. So you have to follow me here." The abbey dean said after a moment of silence, "Since you are here, you don't have to leave." Eldest brother said, "I am an unwelcome guest. It's better for me to leave as soon as possible." The abbey dean looked at him and said calmly, "The rain doesn't keep the guest, but I am here to keep the guest. You have to know that this is the Jisho Abbey, not the back of the mountain of the Academy. You risked your life to come here. What's the difference between you and a bird walking into a trap?" The meaning of this sentence was clear. It was not a threat, but a calm and simple explanation. No one would doubt that in the unknown place the Jisho Abbey was the simplest. However, Haoyin Taoism ruled the world. As the existence above the clouds of Haoyin Taoism, the Jisho Abbey must have very powerful, or even unimaginably powerful means. Eldest brother was very clear about this, but he looked calm. Since he dared to come, he had already prepared his means. The abbey dean waved his sleeves and clouds came out. Between the green mountains and the lake, the aura of heaven and earth suddenly closed. The clear and beautiful autumn sun could not fall. The autumn wind could only pass through the ruined forest behind the Taoist Abbey, but could not pass through the walls of the Taoist Abbey. The big array of the Jisho Abbey was activated. The Taoist Abbey became an independent existence in the Haotian world, but closely related to the Haotian world. No one could leave this small world. Not even the limitless state. Because the aura of heaven and earth in the Jisho Abbey had been completely separated from the aura of heaven and earth around. If eldest brother wanted to leave with the limitless state, he would run into the dense boundary. But he still left, leaving leisurely. His cotton-padded jacket fluttered, and eldest brother's figure suddenly faded and disappeared in the autumn wind by the lake. There was dead silence by the lake. The Abbey Dean looked at the middle-aged Taoist with a cold expression. In these years, the Jisho Abbey had been managed by the middle-aged Taoist. Long Qing could escape from the Taoist Abbey because he followed the Abbey Dean's wishes and deliberately indulged himself. But what was going on now? The middle-aged Taoist's expression became a little gloomy. He sighed and said, "He came back." The Abbey Dean flicked his sleeves and disappeared into the void, leaving two extremely cold words. Unfilial son. No one knew what had happened in the Jisho Abbey. The field in front of the verdant canyon was quiet. The West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army had sounded the gongs to retreat. Today the Divine Hall was about to win a decisive victory. No one had expected that eldest brother of the academy would appear on the battlefield and turn the whole situation around with a string and a stick. Although the Abbey Dean's appearance had injected confidence and fanaticism into the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army, unexpectedly, the Abbey Dean had disappeared. There seemed to be no change in front of the verdant canyon. The coalition army had suffered a series of setbacks. Their own strength was not the main thing. The key was the burning divine chariot, the cavalry corpses all over the ground, and the unbreakable exit of the verdant canyon, which made the soldiers' morale abnormally low. Although they were not desperate, they began to feel tired. Now that the great divine priest of revelation was seriously injured, and the divine chariot was burned and blown into countless flying ashes by the autumn wind, the morale of the army was gradually unstable. Yi Hongyu immediately decided to withdraw the troops in advance. It was still early. The night gradually fell. The porridge pot under the iron canopy at the exit of the verdant canyon was only left with the bottom of the pot. The fragrance of porridge had already spread to the field, without a trace left. The people of the academy were very quiet, which was completely different from last night when they were high-spirited, talking and killing people. Although only 2 days had passed, they were already very tired. Fourth brother held the river and mountain sandbox and coughed from time to time. The front of the academy uniform was full of mottled blood stains. Wang Qi squatted beside him with a medicine bowl and was thinking of ways to feed him medicine. Beigong Weiyang and Shimen Buhua were injured by the teachings. Fortunately, they took medicine in time and were treated by eldest brother. Their injuries had stabilized and their spirits were much better. In fact, second brother was the most tired person. His expression was still so calm, and his sitting posture was still so upright. But everyone could imagine how tired he was at this time. Go to bed early? Second brother looked at the coalition tents in the southern field. Looking at the dense lights that were even brighter than the stars in the sky, he said after a moment of silence, "Tomorrow should be more difficult." The younger brothers and sisters responded, but no one went to sleep. They still sat around fourth brother. At this time, the virtual sword left by the Abbey Dean was still flying in the river and mountain sandbox. Fourth brother had to use his own psyche power to launch the river and mountain sandbox to trap the virtual sword in the yellow sand. He could not put down the sandbox, nor could he rest. He could only endure the pain. No one knew how long he would last or whether he could make it to the end. Second brother walked behind him and sat down. Since he came to the verdant canyon, he had not taken off his armor. Therefore, when he sat down, the sound of the iron armor hitting against each other was extremely clear, firm and stern. Just like what he said later. "It's always easier to lean on each other." Fourth brother smiled slightly, leaned back tiredly and then slowly closed his eyes. Second brother passed the iron sword from his shoulder to the back and put it under his forearm. There was a bright moon in the night sky. The moon was relatively dark, so the stars in the night sky could be seen clearly. Yi Hongyu looked at the night sky quietly with no expression on her face. The great divine priest of revelation had been sent back to the West Hill Divine Palace, but no one knew if he could survive. If Mr. First's rod was aimed at her, how should she deal with it? She thought for a long time and finally came to the conclusion that she could not deal with it. But she was not discouraged, nor did she feel defeated. She had never been that kind of person. She was never the most powerful person. But it turned out that she could always defeat enemies who were stronger than her in the end. At this time she was thinking more about something else. The more she thought about it, the more she frowned. She thought about it for a whole night. Until dawn. The morning light gradually brightened and the wilderness was covered with mist. No one knew whether it would be sunny or cloudy today. Everyone in the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition army was waiting for one person to make a move. Because only that person could defeat the Iron Sword in front of the Verdant Canyon. And everyone firmly believed that as long as that person made a move, he would definitely win. However, Lu Bai still did not make a move. Even the disciples of the Sword Garret began to feel doubtful and puzzled. Yi Hongyu looked at the quiet horse carriage with a hint of sarcasm in her eyes. She respected the Sage of Sword Lu Bai very much. Because of the paper sword in the letter, Lu Bai was even half a teacher to her. But she still felt that Lu Bai was a very stupid person. In her eyes, all pride and self-esteem were stupid. No matter how much pride a person had, it was the same. No matter whether that person was the Abbey Dean or Lu Bai. In this battle of the Verdant Canyon, if the real powerhouses in Haotian Taoism could listen to her command, she had countless ways to directly crush the people of the academy in front of the Verdant Canyon. If Lu Bai was willing to give up his pride in Sword Taoism and cooperate with the cavalry to besiege them, who in the world could resist? If the Abbey Dean was willing to step into the mortal world, how could the academy be a match for Haotian Taoism? The problem was that although she was now the great divine priest of West Hill and was like a god in the hearts of the believers, there were always a few people in the world that she could not influence or control. The Abbey Dean and Lu Bai were such people. Last night she looked at the moon and did not sleep. She suddenly thought of Ning Quebec. She and Ning Ke were the real kindred spirits. Only she and he understood that unscrupulous means were the best means. At this moment, a Buddhist chant came from the thin mist. There is one more chapter. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.